Welcome to the Sleepy War Veteran. In this story, you will be taken in a beautiful documentary to take you on an adventure back into history. Please calm your mind and enjoy the story. By the middle of the 18th century, the Atlantic world breathed in rhythms that tied distant shores together. Wind drove timbered hulls from London, Bristol, and Glasgow, past Madeira and the Azores, into harbors from Boston to Charleston and onto the Sugar Islands. Bills of exchange crossed in the opposite direction, followed by letters, newspapers, and the expectations of people who thought of themselves as both provincial and connected to something larger. The British Empire had grown not from a single plan, but from many decisions. A trading outpost here, a fortified harbor there, settlers pressing inland along river valleys because land and opportunity lay that way. On maps, the colonies colored in the coast. Inland, the terrain belonged to native nations whose diplomacy and war-making shaped the real boundaries of the world the newcomers entered. Tobacco, rice, indigo, and, increasingly, wheat and flour moved outward. Textiles, china, tools and books moved in. New Englanders distilled Caribbean molasses into rum, built ships in riverside yards, and salted fish for distant markets. Farmers across the middle colonies sent barrels of flour down the Delaware and the Hudson, and in the Chesapeake, enslaved laborers cultivated tobacco that perfumed the counting houses of the Thames. In the Carolinas and Georgia, enslaved Africans, some with deep knowledge of rice cultivation, turned tidal swamps into plantations. Enslavement was not a footnote to the economy. It was a foundation for much of its wealth. In port towns, free and enslaved black people, indentured servants, artisans, sailors, merchants, and officials moved through the same streets with different prospects and sharply unequal power. Over these intricate exchanges, the British state draped mercantile rules. Parliament's Navigation Acts, shaped over the 17th century and tidied repeatedly, aimed to channel colonial trade through English ships and English ports. Molasses imported from French and Dutch islands should, by law, pay duties high enough to steer business back toward British sugar. Iron should be smelted and finished at home rather than in colonial forges. Enumerated goods were meant to move only to imperial harbors. In practice, enforcement ebbed and flowed. Smugglers knew the coves. Customs officers knew which fights were worth the trouble. Colonial assemblies understood that a quiet compromise kept wharves busy. Salutary neglect is the phrase later used to describe the long interval when local initiative and imperial oversight found a balance that suited both. Imperial wars disrupted that balance. In North America, the 17th and early 18th centuries had carried repeating cycles of conflict. King William's War, Queen Anne's War, King George's War, each echoing European struggles between Britain and France, and each entangling native nations whose own rivalries and alliances predated all European claims. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Wabanaki, the Shawnee, the Cherokee, the Catawba, and many others set terms where they could, guarding trade, territory, and autonomy amid shifting pressures. By the 1750s, the Ohio Country, the waters between the Allegheny, Monongahela, and Ohio rivers, became the latest focal point. Virginia speculators and French officers sketched overlapping maps onto the same forests. Forts went up at key forks, not because anyone expected them to be permanent, but because, in frontier diplomacy, timber palisades were the grammar of intent. The confrontation that followed became the 7 Years' War, called the French and Indian War in the colonies, and widened into a global conflict fought in Europe, Asia, Africa, and on the seas between. In 1754, a young Virginia officer, George Washington, led a small party into the Ohio headwaters and stumbled into a skirmish that spilled the first blood. By 1756, formal declarations made the local crisis part of a world war. British ministers poured men and money into North America. New England town meetings debated quotas. Pennsylvania, with its Quaker traditions and divided politics, struggled with the demands of defense. Southern assemblies measured their commitments against fears of enslaved uprisings at home. The war's engines were logistics as much as battles. Wagon roads were cut through the Alleghenies. Bateaux slid along inland waterways. Contracts fed columns. Credit smoothed the gaps between promises and deliveries. The British Navy strained French supply lines across the Atlantic, while British regulars, reorganized under commanders who learned from early failures, took strong points one by one. Louisbourg, at the mouth of the St. Lawrence, fell, opening the river. Quebec, after a hazardous night ascent and a short, decisive fight on the Plains of Abraham in 1759, yielded to General James Wolfe's army, even as both commanding generals died in the moment of victory and defeat. Montreal surrendered in 1760. Elsewhere, in India, on the coasts of West Africa, and in Caribbean waters, Britain seized islands and trading posts, prying revenue streams from France and Spain. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1763, France ceded Canada. Spain, which had entered on the French side, traded Florida for Havana's return. British maps swelled. Triumph brought costs that could not be wished away. The British national debt had doubled over the long war. Interest payments and the expense of maintaining a peacetime garrison to police the newly enlarged empire became a standing worry in London. Ministers looked at columns of figures and at a map covered with recent conquests and reached for a policy that made arithmetic sense. Station troops in North America to deter European rivals and to manage relations on the frontiers and ask colonists to contribute a fairer share to the maintenance of imperial security. To many in Parliament, this was not oppression, it was tidying. Counts. Frontiers, meanwhile, resisted tidy lines. In the spring and summer of 1763, a broad native coalition coalesced around the Great Lakes and the Ohio country, led in part by the Ottawa war leader Pontiac and involving a spectrum of communities, striking British forts and settlements in response to heavy-handed new policies and encroachments. Traders had been expelled, gift-giving diplomacy curtailed, promised restraint along the boundary line evaporated in practice. Garrison commanders found themselves besieged. Relief columns fought through ambushes. The violence and reprisals of the campaign left bitter memories on all sides. The British government answered with the Proclamation of 1763, drawing a line along the crest of the Appalachians, beyond which settlement was, in principle, to be restrained until proper treaties could be made. On paper, it was a pause, a way to cool the frontier while land cessions were negotiated. To land-hungry colonists and speculators, it looked like a barrier between them and the interior they had imagined as their future. To native nations, it was both a promise and a test. Money and management drove the next steps. British officials reviewed colonial finances and found a patchwork. Locally issued paper currencies that rose and fell in value, customs duties collected unevenly, and a political culture in which colonial assemblies guarded their right to tax themselves. Parliament moved to regularize. The Currency Acts, first in 1751 for New England and more broadly in 1764, restricted colonial paper money as legal tender. The Sugar Act of 1764 lowered the nominal duty on molasses from non-British sources, but promised stricter enforcement and expanded the customs bureaucracy, with vice admiralty courts to try smuggling cases without local juries. In London, this looked like reform. In Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston, it felt like a new kind of presence. To understand why, it helps to hear how colonists described their political world. They spoke the language of rights inherited from English history: trial by jury, security of property, the consent of the governed, expressed through their elected assemblies. No taxation without representation did not appear full-blown in 1764, but the premise had deep roots. Colonial assemblies had long voted internal taxes and paid salaries. London set duties to steer trade. Locals levied rates to mend roads and pay sheriffs. That division, practical more than doctrinal, made the British government's new revenue measures feel like a trespass, not merely a change in account books. At the same time, the colonies were more connected than they had ever been. A busy press printed newspapers in every major town. Post riders carried news quickly along improved roads. Pamphlets leapt the gaps between regions. Benjamin Franklin had printed sermons and almanacs before he carried colonial petitions to London. The Great Awakening of the 1730s and 1740s had taught ordinary people to speak in public and to distrust comfortable authorities. Political mobilization would borrow those habits of meeting, testifying, and insisting that distant power listen. In taverns and assembly halls, merchants and farmers argued practicalities. Would stricter customs enforcement ruin profitable trades? Would a standing army, stationed in towns, impose costs and invite corruption? Who would appoint the new customs officials, and to whom would they answer? London's reforms arrived as specific measures. The colonial response at first did too. Petitions went forward. Moderates negotiated for relief or for time. Customs men took their posts and found that enforcing rules on paper required allies on wharves, not just warrants in desk drawers. The tinder, once assembled, needed only a spark. It came in 1765, when Parliament introduced a measure that seemed, in London, both straightforward and limited. A stamp duty on legal documents, newspapers, and a range of printed materials sold in the colonies. A similar tax had helped finance British wars at home. Applied overseas, it would be collected in coin through designated stamp distributors. The principle was plain. Colonists would help support the imperial garrison that protected them. The effect, however, would reach far beyond a ledger entry, because paper was the nervous system of colonial life. Deeds, court filings, bills of lading, newspapers, every layer of daily order carried ink. A stamp on the corner would be both a revenue mark and a symbol. Before word of that act rippled through post roads and harbor gossip, there had been warning signs of a changing imperial hand. New writs of assistance, broad search warrants, authorized customs officers to look for smuggled goods. A permanent board of customs commissioners was in the offing. Vice Admiralty courts would sit without local juries to hear revenue cases. Each step, considered singly, could be defended as administrative housekeeping. Together, they rearranged the relationship between colonies and metropole in ways people felt in their purses and in their pride. Beyond the administrative tangle lay the human arithmetic of empire. British taxpayers paid far higher rates than colonists, and many in Parliament judged it reasonable to spread the burden. Colonial agents in London pointed out that provincial contributions had been heavy during the late war, through supplies, bounties, and local debt, and that prosperity in London owed much to colonial markets. The conversation rocked back and forth across the Atlantic, complicated by distance and timing. By the time a petition arrived, a bill might already have passed. By the time an assurance was sent, a riot might have changed the facts on the ground. Misunderstanding in this climate was less an accident than an inevitability. When people in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston gathered to discuss these changes. They did so in places the authorities could not easily silence. Wharves at dusk, tavern rooms with shuttered windows, open fields outside town where a liberty pole could be planted. Newspapers published essays under classical pen names, linking the new measures to old cautionary tales about power. Printers who had thrived in the wide freedoms of the Atlantic press turned their own medium into a forum. Merchants drafted non-importation agreements, promising to suspend the purchase of certain British goods until policies changed. Ordinary men, artisans, sailors, apprentices, found themselves asked to enforce those boycotts by pressure on shopkeepers and customs men who broke ranks. All of this, the growth of an empire in fits and starts, the long seasons of flexible enforcement, the sobering victory over France, the debt that followed, the attempt to regularize a sprawling realm, the security concerns on the frontiers, the language of rights sharpened in print, the stirrings of economic self-assertion, made the colonies a place where a tax could be more than a tax. A stamp impressed on a page would, in the months ahead, press on identity too. A quarrel over revenue would open a broader argument about representation and authority. Local protests would begin to touch global nerves because Britain's rivals watched every misstep and every overreaction for advantage. As summer 1765 approached, ships carried the text of Parliament's new measure into colonial harbours. Post riders spread the news interior-ward. Stamp distributors, named by London, received commissions and, in some cases, advice to keep their heads down. Assemblies drafted formal protests that matched careful language to firm claims. In neighborhoods, men who called themselves Sons of Liberty began to meet, loosely organized at first, more coordinated as weeks passed, ready to make the argument not only in pamphlets and petitions, but in the theater of streets. The logic that had guided imperial trade was about to collide with the politics that guided colonial life. In the next part of this story, the paper itself will become a stage. Sealed packages of stamps. No one dares to sell. Court sessions adjourned for lack of lawful paper. Printers deciding whether a masthead carries deference or defiance. Out on the wharves, boxes labeled with familiar manufacturers will be refused, ships sent back, and the faces of a far-off Parliament will become, to the colonists who had once boasted of their British rights, the faces of a government they are no longer sure they recognize. The first packages of stamped paper arrived in harbors under quiet guard, bundles sealed with wax, inventories in neat London hands, instructions to local distributors on how to begin, November the 1st, 1765. The tax itself was simple in design. A duty on printed matter, deeds and contracts, court filings, newspapers, almanacs, even playing cards, collected by affixing an official stamp. In Britain, similar duties had long raised revenue without much fuss. In the colonies, where paper carried commerce, law, and opinion, the stamp was more than a mark. It was an assertion about who could reach into daily life. News of the law's passage reached Virginia in the spring, before the stamps did. In May, the House of Burgesses debated a set of resolves drafted by a young lawyer, Patrick Henry. Their substance was not novel to colonial ears, that colonists brought with them the rights of Englishmen, that their own assemblies had the sole right to tax them, that anyone who argued otherwise endangered liberty. Some of the more biting clauses were printed widely, even though they were not formally adopted, magnifying their effect. In coffee houses and taverns from Williamsburg to Boston, the Virginia resolves read like a signal that the argument had moved from polite petition into a firmer register. Appointments set the next scene. In town after town, London named stamp distributors, customs men, lawyers, merchants of good standing, to sell the stamped paper when it arrived. In Boston, Andrew Oliver accepted the post. On an August morning, townspeople found an effigy of him swinging from a great elm at the edge of town. The tree would be christened the Liberty Tree that day. As the crowd grew, the effigy was cut down and carried through the streets. Oliver's proposed office, an unoccupied building, was torn apart. By night's end, the message was plain enough that he resigned. 2 weeks later, a larger crowd wrecked the mansion of Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson, smashing windows and scattering his books and papers into the street, an act that horrified as many as it thrilled. The violence was not uniform, nor always admired, but it proved that enforcement would not be routine. The pattern repeated along the seaboard. In Newport, New Haven, New York, Philadelphia, Annapolis, and Charleston, stamp agents were met with processions, bonfires, and speeches that veered from theater to threat until resignation letters followed. The name Sons of Liberty began to be used, first for local clubs of merchants, artisans, and mariners who organized protests, then for a loose network that passed news and tactics along post roads. Liberty poles went up in town squares. In print, newspapers boxed the announcement of the act with black borders or printed skull and crossbones where the stamp should have been. Editors explained to readers why the next issue might be their last unless the law changed. As November approached, the practical problems multiplied. Courts could not sit if filings had to be on stamped paper no one would sell. Ship captains hesitated to clear out of port lest their papers be judged improper in the next harbor. Merchants met and wrote non-importation agreements, promising to suspend orders for certain British goods until the act was repealed. In New York, a merchant compact in late October set a model that other towns adopted. Social pressure gave it teeth. Shopkeepers who sold prescribed goods were named in print. Customers were urged to walk past their doors. Women, who controlled household spending, began to translate political feeling into purchasing choices, an impulse that would become more visible in later boycotts. At the same time, colonial assemblies tried to make their argument in the language of law. In October 1765, delegates from 9 colonies, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, and South Carolina, met in New York City for what became known as the Stamp Act Congress. They drafted a declaration of rights and grievances that affirmed loyalty to the Crown and Parliament's role in regulating trade, but insisted that taxation required representation, which in the colonial constitution meant their own assemblies. Petitions went to the king and to both houses of Parliament. The tone was careful, the claims broad, and the mere fact of coordinated intercolonial deliberation was itself new. On the ground, the law largely failed to take effect. Some colonies locked the stamps in forts or ships. In others, distributors quit before a sale could be made. Courts adjourned in November for want of stamped paper and then reopened in early 1766 by local decision, declaring that justice could not be suspended indefinitely. Newspapers, after a pause in some towns, resumed with editorial explanations and a variety of workarounds. Only Georgia, for a brief interval in February 1766, used the stamps under pressure from its governor before returning to the informal norm elsewhere. Carry on without them. London watched the disruption through several lenses at once. George Grenville, the prime minister who had sponsored the measure, had fallen from power. The Marquis of Rockingham led a new ministry that was less invested in defending the specific law and more concerned with restoring order and trade. British merchants, facing cancelled orders and unpaid accounts, petitioned for repeal. Benjamin Franklin, in London as agent for several colonies, testified before the House of Commons in February 1766, answering questions with a mixture of practicality and constitutional argument. He drew a line, more tactical than philosophical, but effective in that chamber, between duties on trade, which colonists had long tolerated, and internal taxes like the stamp, which they had not consented to. He also pointed out a fact the petitions and boycotts had made clear. The act could not be enforced without an army, and an army would be costly. On March 18, 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. Bells rang in colonial towns, dinners were held, toasts multiplied to the King and to William Pitt, who had argued for repeal on grounds of expediency and principle. Bonfires lit harbor edges. In New York, where tensions had been sharpest, the relief was immediate. But the same day, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, asserting the right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Many in Britain saw it as a necessary salve to constitutional pride. Many in the colonies read it as a warning that the underlying question had been deferred, not decided. Other measures kept irritation alive. The Quartering Act of 1765, passed alongside the stamp measure, required colonies to provide barracks and certain supplies for British troops. It did not mandate lodging soldiers in private homes, but it did burden local treasuries and stirred fears of a standing army in peacetime. New York's assembly balked at the cost and was, in 1767, briefly suspended by Parliament when it refused full compliance. Arguments about virtual representation. Parliament's claim that all Britons were represented by its members wherever they lived met colonial insistence on actual, local consent. The conversation that had begun with paper now touched on the architecture of empire. In the Boston press, James Otis Jr. and other writers kept the debate public and sharp. Printers published pamphlets by the dozen, some signed, many under classical pseudonyms. Town meetings instructed representatives to defend the principle that taxes must be voted close to home. Even in celebration, the relief carried an edge of vigilance. The effigy poles stood where they had been planted, the Liberty Tree's limbs filled with notices. A year that might have ended a quarrel instead taught both sides their strengths. Colonists learned that coordinated economic pressure and local mobilization could change policy. Ministers learned that a rickety revenue measure could cost them more than it raised. The repeal also reshaped imperial administration. Believing that inconsistent enforcement had helped create the crisis, Parliament moved to make customs collection more uniform. The next set of measures would take that form. Duties on imported goods, collected at ports and backed by a reorganized customs service based in the colonies themselves. In 1767, Chancellor of the Exchequer Charles Townshend proposed, and Parliament passed new levies on glass, paper, paint, lead, and tea. The last, a symbol of British identity as much as a commodity. A new American Board of Customs Commissioners would be headquartered in Boston to supervise enforcement. Revenue from these duties was earmarked in part to pay colonial governors and judges directly, reducing Assembly's leverage. Non-importation, which had begun as a practical response to the stamp measure, prepared to return as a political tool. Merchants in several towns revived their agreements. Committees formed to monitor compliance. Women's choices at the market stall, homespun over imported cloth, local tea substitutes over the East India Company's leaves, took on new public meaning. In New York, a liberty pole raised by the Sons of Liberty became a point of contest with soldiers who cut it down and watched it rise again. In Boston, the arrival of the customs commissioners would bring red-coated regiments in their train, and with them a new set of street-level confrontations. In that brief interval between repeal and the next round, The colonies lived with the knowledge that they had moved a government 3,000 miles away, and yet had not answered the basic question either side had posed. If Parliament could legislate in all cases whatsoever, what limits held? If assemblies alone could tax, what place was left for imperial revenue? A customs duty collected at a wharf looked modest compared to a stamp on a deed, but it asserted the same claim. The tools learned in 1765, fast news, coordinated economic pressure, ritualized protest, were still at hand. So were the habits of a great power that, chastened by one crisis, had resolved to govern more closely the next time. As ships cleared for London in the summer of 1767, holds filled with grain and timber, while in counting houses, clerks copied the text of the new duties into bound ledgers. Across the ocean, ministers who had never seen a liberty pole believed that a handful of port charges would mend the imperial budget. In waterfront taverns, men who had never seen Westminster considered whether they would drink taxed tea. The road from a tax to a global war bent gently in such rooms, with a stamp that would not stick, a declaration that would not be forgotten, and a set of customs men preparing to take their places in a city that had just learned what to do with officials who arrived bearing new rules. By the time the first crates of glass, paper, paint, lead, and tea were assessed under the new duties, the arguments that had flared over stamps had settled into habits. Merchants kept ledgers with two columns in mind: orders and principles. Printers measured each masthead against risk. Assemblies weighed how hard to push without losing the governor's ear. The Townshend program did not ask people to line up for stamps. It came ashore as entries in customs books and as officials with instructions to stay. The difference mattered. Enforcement would not revolve around a single day as the stamp regime had. It would become a daily presence at wharves and in counting houses. The essays came first. In the winter of 1767 to 1768, a series of letters signed by a farmer appeared in Philadelphia newspapers and were quickly reprinted from New Hampshire to Georgia. The author, John Dickinson, a lawyer and legislator, wrote calmly from premises readers recognized that Parliament's right to regulate imperial trade was real, but that raising revenue in the colonies without their consent was not. He worried less over the size of the duties than over the principle behind them. If governors and judges were to be paid out of those revenues, he argued, colonial assemblies would lose the lever that had long allowed them to insist on local standards. It was not a firebrand's tract. Its steady tone made it more influential. In Boston, the town meeting and the House of Representatives read the same measures against their own experience. Samuel Adams, clerk of the House and tireless committeeman, helped draft a circular letter to other assemblies in early 1768. It did not summon rebellion. It rehearsed constitutional claims that taxation required representation, that the Townshend duties, being for revenue, violated that arrangement, and that colonies should consult one another. The ministry's answer was swift. Lord Hillsborough, newly appointed to oversee American affairs, instructed the governor to demand that the House rescind its circular. The vote in June became a number that traveled as a badge. 92 to 17 refused rescission. The governor dissolved the House for its trouble. In Virginia, when news of the dissolution reached Williamsburg, the burgesses passed their own resolves on taxation and standing armies. The governor dissolved them too, and the members retired to a private room at the Raleigh Tavern to draft an association that pledged non-importation. The rhythm that had developed in one town now moved between colonies. Enforcement, meanwhile, acquired a local address. In the autumn of 1767, Parliament created an American Board of Customs Commissioners and put its headquarters in Boston. The board's work was not theoretical. It issued writs, hired tidewaiters and searchers, kept schedules, and expected local officials to cooperate. The harbor, where compromise had long smoothed the roughness of mercantile law, now had a staff dedicated to tightening it. Customs seizures followed. In June 1768, officers detained John Hancock's sloop Liberty, alleging that its captain had locked the hatches and landed Madeira wine without the proper entries. A crowd gathered, men pelted customs officials, a boat was destroyed, and by night the commissioners had withdrawn for safety to Castle William in the harbor. For many in Boston, the episode illustrated arbitrary power. For the commissioners, it proved their point about evasion and threats. Each side wrote memoranda that traveled to London and back. Troops followed the paper. In the late summer and early autumn of 1768, 2 regiments arrived to back the customs service and to project imperial resolve. Red coats on Boston streets changed the soundscape. Drums in the morning, sentry calls at corners, barracks disputes in a town accustomed to controlling its own policing. The law did not require households to lodge soldiers in private homes, but the Quartering Act obliged the province to find space and supplies. Rope-walk workers and soldiers brawled. Sentries and boys jeered each other in a daily theater of proximity. The press filled with narratives of affronts on both sides. The soldiers drilled on the common. Juries tried to do their work. The Customs Board kept books that showed modest revenues and a great deal of contention. In print, wit and symbol kept pace with policy. Boston papers carried a new anthem, the Liberty Song, words by Dickinson set to a familiar tune, sung at dinners where toasts doubled as manifestos. Engravers borrowed classical figures to depict Britannia turning away from grasping ministers, and mastheads sprouted devices, caps, trees, intertwined hands that readers could recognize at a glance. In New York, a tall liberty pole rose and was cut down by soldiers, rose again and was cut down again, until it became a wooden register of stubbornness. Merchants revived non-importation agreements in 1768 and 1769. Committees monitored compliance, and women turned household choices into policy by choosing homespun and local substitutes for British textiles and tea. Ships arrived to find consignments left on the wharves until the agreements loosened months later. The costs of a quarrel showed in both directions. British manufacturers wrote to members of the Parliament that orders were down. Warehouses held unsold cloth. Credit was tightening. In America, store shelves were barer. Court calendars slipped. Politics absorbed hours that would otherwise have gone to work. Yet the new network held. Town meetings sent circulars to other towns urging steadiness. Newspapers reprinted each city's resolves as models for the next. Coastal riders carried news faster than the debates in London could adjust to it. The colonies were not unified. They were coordinated enough that a policy felt contested in the same way in places that had never met. Inevitably, a spark found tinder. On the cold afternoon of March 5th, 1770, in Boston, an argument at a sentry post near the custom house escalated into a confrontation. Boys taunted a private. Townsmen pressed closer. A bell sounded, whether as an alarm for fire or a rally for trouble depends on the account. More soldiers arrived under Captain Thomas Preston. Snowballs, ice, and insults flew in both directions. Someone was struck, someone slipped, a musket discharged, then a ragged volley. When the smoke cleared, 5 people lay dead or dying, among them Crispus Attucks, a sailor of African and native descent, often named first thereafter, and several more were wounded. The town shuddered at the sight of blood in the snow on familiar stones. The hours that followed were a test of whether the routines of a town could hold. Samuel Adams and other select men met with the acting governor and military officers. The soldiers were withdrawn to barracks on Castle Island. A special court took shape. The funerals drew thousands in a procession that moved through silent streets. The trials themselves, in the autumn, sought not theater, but verdicts. John Adams and Josiah Quincy, both leading lawyers and political critics of imperial policy, defended Captain Preston and the soldiers on the ground that evidence, not politics, must rule in a court. Witnesses disagreed under questioning. Jurors weighed their duty. Preston was acquitted. 6 soldiers were acquitted. 2 were convicted of manslaughter rather than murder and received the ritual penalty, branding on the thumb, before being released. The outcome steadied some and angered others, but it displayed a civic habit precious to the town, that even in crisis, law could be law. The same month blood darkened Boston's snow. Politics in London shifted. Charles Townshend had died in 1767. Ministries had wobbled in the intervening years. Lord North, rising to lead the government in 1770, saw that the duties were doing more harm than good and moved to repeal them, all except the tax on tea. That remnant was a signal as much as a revenue source. Parliament would not seem to retreat entirely. The declaratory principle announced in 1766 would not be allowed to look hollow. In the colonies, non-importation agreements were eased or abandoned. Orders resumed for many goods. The tea tax remained like a small stone in a shoe that continued to shape a walk out of all proportion to its size. Elsewhere, disputes continued without snow or volleys. In New York, the struggle over quartering and the Liberty Pole had already brought arrests, pamphlets, and parades. In Virginia, George Washington and George Mason drafted new non-importation resolutions in 1769. The governor dissolved the House, and the members convened at the Raleigh Tavern to adopt them in an extra-legal form. One by one, colonies rehearsed the same choreography: assembly votes, gubernatorial dissolutions, meetings in taverns or churches, petitions sent and answered in formulas that no longer persuaded their recipients. What had been a localized quarrel now had a repertoire. All the while, the presence of troops in Boston had forced adjustments in daily life that became a lesson in political theory. A standing army in peacetime, colonists argued, corrupted both soldier and citizen. Soldiers poorly paid might take other work and undercut local laborers. Citizens used to soldiers in their streets might tolerate more than they should. Officers wrote to London that they could not enforce civil law and that they should not be asked to. Townsmen wrote that a red coat on a corner made every arrest feel like. When Parliament moved most of the troops out of the town after the trials, it took heat out of Boston's daily frictions without cooling the underlying dispute. The press found its images for these years and fixed them in public memory. Paul Revere's engraving of the March 5th confrontation, derived from Henry Pelham's drawing, spread a sharp, simplified scene. Soldiers in a line, muskets level, townspeople falling, a distant steeple marking a place that readers in other colonies could imagine as their own. Conservative writers pushed back with accounts of mob provocation and of necessary order badly misunderstood. The contest over narrative was as persistent as the contest over policy. People in Charleston or Philadelphia who had never seen Boston could picture it because printers made them witnesses. Commerce, which had helped ignite protest by serving as the lever for non-importation, now did its opposite. Repeal brought goods in, and with them a reason to hope that the quarrel might default to an old normal. Shop windows filled. Shipyards threw up scaffolding. Farmers counted barrels for export again. Yet everyone also knew what had been learned: how to coordinate across provinces, how to use committees to turn private choices into public pressure. how to make symbols, trees, poles, dinners, and songs do political work, how to keep order in the streets after order had broken. The knowledge could not be unlearned. Legal structures were changing too. Part of the revenue from customs had been intended to pay governors and judges. As that plan ripened in some provinces, assemblies pushed back, not only because they disliked the principle, but because they understood the consequences. A judge paid by the crown rather than by a local appropriation would be insulated from local standards. The argument over a line in a budget was in fact an argument about who would interpret law. When Massachusetts learned in 1772 that its superior court judges would receive royal salaries, town meetings demanded that the practice end. A committee of correspondence, an old device with a new purpose, was formed to keep towns informed and tied together between sessions of the House. Other colonies watched and adopted similar committees, turning ad hoc networks into semi-permanent structures. Minor incidents sharpened resentments. Customs enforcement off Rhode Island led in 1772 to the burning of the British schooner Gaspee after it ran aground while pursuing a suspected smuggler. A commission of inquiry with power to send suspects to England for trial set alarms ringing far beyond Narragansett Bay. The case would not end in convictions, but it convinced many that enforcement was moving from irritation toward something that would uproot familiar rights. In Boston, the earlier uproar over the liberty had never quite faded. Its owner, John Hancock, grew into a symbol large enough to be loved or hated on sight. The men chosen as sheriffs and constables in town after town were evaluated as much for their political sympathies as for their competence. If the repeal of most of the townsend duties had been meant to take the heat out of the crisis, the tea that remained untaxed at the dock kept the water warm. The East India Company, staggering under debts and warehouses full of leaf, was about to receive a legislative favor that ministers imagined would solve several problems at once. Cheap tea for colonists, relief for a vital company, and the quiet acceptance of a small duty that would vindicate Parliament's right to tax. But those calculations belonged to another season. For the moment, after the trials in Boston and the easing of most duties, the colonies felt the pause that often comes before a storm's second line. Ships continued to clear for London with grain and timber. Convoys arrived with cloth and hardware. Customs men kept their tallies, and in the background, committees met without hurry, maintaining correspondence so that no town would be surprised the next time a policy passed in Westminster crossed the ocean as crates stamped with official seals. The arguments had sharpened into tools. The tools, once fashioned, were being stored in plain sight. When the next measure came, it would be packaged as a bargain rather than a tax. The colonies would open those cupboards and take the tools down without asking anyone to remind them how to use them. The East India Company's crisis gave Parliament its next idea. In 1772, a credit shock rattled London and Amsterdam. Merchants failed. Paper promises were tested. The company, sovereign in parts of India and a pillar of British finance, carried warehouses heavy with unsold tea and a balance sheet that worried ministers. The Tea Act of 1773 was drawn as a rescue, allow the company to ship tea directly to the colonies, refund most duties paid in Britain, and keep in place the small townsend duty collected on arrival. Legal tea could now be cheaper than the smuggled Dutch leaf the colonies had long favored, and the revenue would quietly affirm Parliament's right to tax. The arithmetic in London felt elegant. At colonial wharves, the calculation ran differently. Direct consignments cut American merchants out of a trade they had come to rely upon. The duty, however modest, opened the old question of consent. In Philadelphia and New York, committees moved before the ships arrived. Consignees, often relatives of royal officials, were urged to resign. When a company ship neared the Delaware, pilots were told there would be no clearance. The vessel turned back. In New York, consignees backed away from their appointments under pressure, while crowds watched the harbor. In Charleston, tea landed but was not sold. It was stored in damp warehouses where bales spoiled slowly, an enforcement by humidity as much as by policy. Annapolis saw a more theatrical end. When the brig Peggy Stewart paid duty on a small consignment, public anger did not dwindle until, in October 1774, the owner himself set his vessel ablaze at the wharf, a bright warning against compromise. Boston's sequence moved with the steady pace of town meeting and deadline. The Dartmouth, the first tea ship, arrived late in November 1773. The Eleanor and the Beaver followed. By law, cargoes had to be entered within 20 days, or the customs service could seize them. Once entered, the ships could not depart without a clearance that the governor would not grant unless the duty were paid. Meetings filled Old South Meeting House with thousands. Merchants, artisans, sailors, farmers drawn in from nearby towns, resolving that the tea must leave harbor untaxed. The consignees, among them the governor's kin, refused to resign. The owner of the Dartmouth was pressed to seek a clearance. The governor refused. The 20 days ticked down. On the evening of December the 16th, after hours of debate, the Assembly in Old South adjourned with the sense that the law's trap had sprung. Men moved from words to action with practiced quiet. Disguises were simple, blankets and soot enough to blur faces in the winter dark. And the signal, remembered later in different phrases, was only that the meeting could do no more. Parties boarded the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver in turn. Chests were broken and leaves spilled into the cold water. Care was taken. Nothing but tea, no theft, no gratuitous wrecking. By morning, the harbor smelled brisk and the legal position was unambiguous. The duty had not been paid. The tea was gone. Ministers in London read the reports as a challenge not merely to revenue, but to authority. The response was a set of measures meant to correct Massachusetts and instruct the rest. The Boston Port Act closed the town's harbor to commerce until restitution was made. Its provisions took effect June 1st, 1774, turning wharves into idle timber and pushing trade north and south. The Massachusetts Government Act rewrote the province's charter, councilors to be royal appointees, town meetings sharply limited, aimed at the mechanisms that had given protest coherence. The Administration of Justice Act allowed royal officials accused of capital crimes committed in handling disturbances to be tried elsewhere in the empire, a provision colonists called the Murder Act. A new quartering act broadened arrangements for housing troops. These, in British phrasing, were coercive acts, a lesson to one colony that would restore the whole. In colonial usage, they became intolerable. The governor who would carry the lesson into Boston was General Thomas Gage. He arrived with orders and sympathy for the city he knew well from earlier service. The port closed, the seat of government was shifted to Salem and then Cambridge. Court sessions under new rules met resistance. In the Massachusetts countryside, county conventions declared the charter changes void and urged towns not to cooperate. In September, Suffolk County's delegates gathered and adopted resolves that rejected the new acts, called for payment only to officials chosen under the old forms, and encouraged the training of militias. When these Suffolk resolves reached other provinces in print, they felt like a model of firmness that stopped short of violence. Elsewhere, tea ships faced their own endings. In New York and Philadelphia, consignments were turned back without spectacle. In Charleston, the bales continued to molder under guard. In Annapolis, The burning of the Peggy Stewart stood as a local extreme accomplished with a public choreography that stressed consent. The owner, not a mob, lighted the fire. The breadth of these answers mattered as much as their particulars. Committees in port towns showed that coordination no longer depended on a single city's temper. Colonial assemblies, dissolved and reconstituted, moved toward a wider consultation. In May 1774, Virginia's House of Burgesses heard of the Port Act, appointed a day of fasting and prayer, and was dissolved for its pains. Members repaired to the Raleigh Tavern and drafted a call for a general congress. Through the summer, colonies chose delegates. When they gathered in early September at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia, the First Continental Congress met with courtesies that masked urgency. Joseph Galloway of Pennsylvania proposed a plan of union that would have created a grand council in the colonies to coordinate with Parliament. It was debated and narrowly set aside. Patrick Henry, new to the room but not to the argument, spoke for a continental identity that outpaced provincial loyalties. John Adams and Samuel Adams, George Washington, John Jay, John Dickinson, and many others labored over documents meant to persuade rather than to inflame. Their acts framed both a protest and a program. The Declaration and Resolves asserted rights of petition, of trial by jury, of local taxation by elected assemblies. Addresses were penned to the people of Great Britain, arguing kinship and injustice, to the colonies of Quebec and the British West Indies, inviting a common cause, and to the King requesting redress. The Continental Association, adopted in October, set out non-importation, non-consumption, and, if needed, non-exportation, with dates and details. To give it life, Congress urged the creation of local committees of inspection to monitor compliance and mediate disputes. In towns and counties, those committees took on tasks that looked like governance, checking invoices, discouraging hoarding, publishing the names of those who broke the agreements, and seeking reconciliation where possible. The political map thickened with local institutions ready to act. General Gage, watching from Boston, sought to prevent trouble by removing the means for it. On September 1st, 1774, under orders, a detachment quietly removed stores of powder from a provincial magazine at Charlestown. The news raced faster than the soldiers' carts. Militia mustered by the thousands and marched toward Boston, the powder alarm, before rumor outran fact and the ranks turned back. The lesson was plain to all who paid attention. The countryside could move at a day's notice. The army, outnumbered beyond the neck, fortified its lines. In December, men in New Hampshire, alerted by riders, seized powder and cannon from Fort William and Mary near Portsmouth. British officers protested. Colonial committees took careful notes. Small encounters sketched the outline of a larger one. Through the winter of 1774 to 1775, the association's rules settled into daily behavior. Women organized spinning meetings. Homespun cloth became both necessity and signal. Tea, where it remained available, was shunned or hidden depending on the neighborhood. Committees kept lists. Some drew lines too sharply. Others sought to keep neighbors within the fold. In Massachusetts, the old militia system was tuned for speed. Minute companies, men pledged to be ready quickly, elected officers and practiced in fields that had grown stones and suns for a century. Cartridge boxes were mended, powder horns checked. Towns debated how far they would go if the army marched. In London, the reaction to Congress's petitions and the association was a mixture of calculation and delay. Lord North offered a conciliation plan in early 1775, allowing a colony that raised its own revenue for imperial purposes to be relieved of parliamentary taxes. It asked for trust where little remained and arrived late to a conversation that had moved beyond single measures. Parliament tightened enforcement. Commanders received firmer instructions. The belief that a show of force might restore deference lingered in more than one mind. In Boston, Gage tested the roads around the city. In February 1775, a column under Colonel Alexander Leslie moved to seize cannon reportedly housed in Salem. A drawn bridge and an audience of townspeople slowed the march. After negotiations and a short advance to satisfy honor, the soldiers returned to Boston without their prize. Each such moment taught both sides a rule: that neighbors would gather quickly to block a road, that officers who avoided bloodshed could still claim obedience to orders, that the next attempt would need to be swifter and farther. Across the colonies, the quarrel had already redrawn private lives. Merchants' holdings became political statements. Ministers preached fast days with a precision long absent from their calendars. Printers set type in forms that committees requested. Sheriffs weighed whom to press and whom to placate. In Edenton, North Carolina, in October 1774, 51 women gathered to sign a public pledge to uphold the association's boycott, a form of political expression that stretched the habits of the age and revealed how thoroughly households were enlisted. By March, the harbor ice was gone. Roads hardened after thaw. Patrols adjusted their routes. Lists grew longer. Lists of consignees who had resigned, of soldiers quartered in barns, of barrels of flour pledged to neighbors under the association, of names elected to committees of inspection, of militia officers chosen at town meetings. The next movement depended less on ideas, which had been rehearsed to fluency, than on distances and timing. A night ride, a march along familiar milestones, a stack of musket balls counted beside a hearth. When spring finally broke open, what had begun as an argument about paper and price presented itself as a question of who could move faster and who would fire first. The lines laid down by tea and acts and associations had become roads. Through the first days of March 1776, the lines around Boston stayed quiet to the ear and frantic to the eye. Wagons creaked at night with their wheels wrapped in straw. Ox teams pulled sledges with muffled chains. Men carried bundled brush, fascines and gabions, up frozen slopes south of the town. Henry Knox's noble train of artillery, hauled all winter from the lakes, lay ready. On the evening of March 4th, under a moon filtered by high clouds, working parties moved onto the twin rises of Dorchester Heights. They stacked timbers, filled wicker frames with earth and stone, rolled barrels into place, and in a single night lifted walls where none had stood at dusk. Before first light, the guns looked down on the harbor and the town from a position that had not figured in British routines the day before. At dawn, red-coated sentries stared south and understood at once what the new outline meant. From those heights, heavy guns could rake the anchorage and enfilade streets. General William Howe weighed options: assault across open ground or evacuation. He chose first to strike. Boats gathered. Light infantry and grenadiers prepared to land, form, and climb, but March weather has its own command. A gale rose, snow and sleet driving hard across the bay, seas pitching small craft against one another. The assault was postponed, and then, with the storm still grinding the water, abandoned. Howe's council of war took the hint the weather had delivered. Boston could not be held under those guns without prohibitive loss. Negotiation produced a practical arrangement. If the provincials refrained from harassing the embarkation, the garrison and those who wished to leave with it would go. In the days that followed, wharves filled with baggage and supplies. Families who had cast their lot with the crown. Officials, merchants, and artisans, who feared what a rebel town would mean for them, boarded transports with what they could carry. On March 17th, 1776, sails rose across the harbor as the last regiments filed onto boats and the fleet weighed for Halifax. Washington's army moved into a town gutted by requisition and firewood cutting, but free of an occupying force. Congress sent thanks. New Englanders kept the date as Evacuation Day thereafter. Washington did not linger. He toured the forts, left a skeleton garrison, and marched the main body south and then west to the next likely blow. New York, with its deep harbor, central position, and wealth, would draw the British fleet. Through April and May, soldiers and laborers turned Manhattan and Long Island into a belt of works. On the Hudson, engineers sank chevaux de frise, framed obstacles meant to tear the bottoms of ships, and laid chains, while on the high ground of northern Manhattan they raised works that would become Fort Washington. Across the river, New Jersey's bluffs gained their twin, Fort Lee. Batteries dotted points along the East River. It was a hedge, not a guarantee. In the South, the war's outlines sharpened in three scenes that spring. In North Carolina, Loyalist recruitment had surged under the promise of a British expedition arriving by sea. Patriots moved first. On February 27th at Moore's Creek Bridge, a small Patriot force led by Richard Caswell and Alexander Lillington met a Loyalist column of Highland Scots and others advancing toward Wilmington. The Patriots had pulled up planks and greased the timbers. When Loyalists rushed the crossing, volleys cut them down. The fight was brief and decisive. Dozens killed or wounded, hundreds captured, and the Loyalists rising broken for the season. Royal authority in the colony collapsed with the news. Farther south, a British fleet under Sir Peter Parker with troops under General Henry Clinton sought to take Charleston. On June 28, 1776, they tested the unfinished palmetto log fort on Sullivan's Island that guarded the harbor. Colonel William Moultrie's garrison answered with well-aimed fire. The spongy palmetto absorbed round shot that would have shattered stone. British ships grounded or tangled with tide and shoal. The attack failed. The flag that had fallen from the fort's staff was lifted again, an act celebrated in later retellings, and by day's end the fleet withdrew battered. Clinton's army sailed north to rejoin the main effort. Charleston remained in American hands for 4 more years. Northward, in Canada, the venture begun with high hopes in 1775, ebbed away under pressure from disease, weather, and reinforcement. After the failed assault on Quebec at year's end, smallpox gnawed at the besiegers. In May, British ships pushed up the St. Lawrence with troops and supplies under Governor Guy Carleton and officers newly arrived from Britain, including John Burgoyne. The American camp could not stand. In June, after a sharp reverse near Trois-Rivières, the remnants retreated up the Richelieu and Lake Champlain, burning bridges and floating stores to slow pursuit. They would regroup at the lakes and, later that year, improvise a fleet to delay a British descent, an autumn story of oars and small guns that would buy time far out of proportion to the number of hulls involved. For the present, the northern frontier closed like a door that the winter had only held ajar. Meanwhile, a pamphlet printed in January 1776 kept working in minds. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, plain in style and radical in conclusion, argued that the quarrel had already outrun any future reconciliation. Monarchy, he wrote, was an absurdity. Islands should not rule continents. The colonies owed themselves a separate political life. It sold by the tens of thousands in a year when presses were already busy. Town meetings found its phrases repeated in toasts. Assemblies found its conclusions walking into their chamber with constituents. Colonial governments, some of them already extra-legal after royal dissolutions, began writing new constitutions that rested on popular authority rather than a crown's commission. Through the spring, delegates in Philadelphia felt the floor tilt under them. On May 10th, Congress advised colonies that needed governments to form them on the authority of the people. On June 7th, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia rose and offered a resolution that made the path explicit. That these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, debate opened and, at the request of several delegations, paused while instructions were sought. In the interim, Congress named a committee to draft a declaration in case the resolution carried. Thomas Jefferson took the first pen. John Adams and Benjamin Franklin suggested changes. Roger Sherman and Robert R. Livingston signed their names to the committee's work. While words were pressed into form, sails began to stipple the lower bay. Through June and into July, transports and men of war filled the water from the Narrows to Staten Island, one of the largest forces Britain had ever assembled overseas. General William Howe commanded the army. His brother, Admiral Richard Howe, held the fleet and a commission as a peace envoy to offer pardons and adjustments short of independence. From Staten Island's shore, British officers examined the distant heights through glasses, while up the Hudson, carpenters and laborers kept swinging hammers. The vote came first. On July 2nd, 1776, after a month of local instructions and private persuasion, Congress resolved that the colonies were independent, 12 delegations in favor, New York abstaining until its assembly could concur. 2 days later, on July 4th, the final text of the Declaration was approved, its grievances organized, and its preamble setting out a statement of principle that exceeded the quarrel's practical origins. John Dunlap's press struck the first broadsides that night. Copies ran along post roads and into encampments. In New York, Washington had it read to his brigades on July 9th. That evening, a crowd surged to Bowling Green and pulled down the gilded equestrian statue of George III. The lead was reportedly carted off to be cast into musket balls, a literal conversion of a symbol into means. The Howes tried diplomacy first. Letters addressed to George Washington Esquire or George Washington, etc., arrived under flag. Washington returned them unopened. Titles mattered because they carried recognition of the army he led. A meeting would come later in the year. For now, the British command balanced conciliation with the knowledge that weight lay in battalions. On Staten Island, Hessian auxiliaries, German troops contracted by British treaties, disembarked with drums and standards, adding to a mixed army that would by August outnumber defenders by a margin measured in thousands. All summer, New York braced. Defensive lines on Long Island stretched from the heights above Brooklyn south toward the marshes. Redoubts dotted the approaches to the East River. Guns on Governor's Island and along the Manhattan shore faced narrows and channels. Infantry rotated through work parties and watch. Congress, which had voted independence, still issued warrants and counted coin, trying to keep powder, lead, and cloth moving where needed. The new states wrote regulations and appointed officers. In the taverns where men had once argued the cost of a stamp, maps now lay open beside mugs. In the long harbor light of July evenings and the hot blue mornings of August, the two sides finished their preparations. Loyalists came and went by boat to Staten Island with information and guesses. Continental scouts moved by skiff to measure soundings and watch landings. The fleet at anchor looked like a forest laid on its side. Within a few weeks, boats would ground on Long Island beaches before dawn. The campaign that followed would test whether a city hemmed by rivers could be held against command of the sea, whether an army that had learned to build and stand around Boston could maneuver while outmatched, and whether men who had just heard themselves called citizens of independent states could hold their nerve in the face of a power those words had not yet reduced. In the meantime, other threads of the year ran on. Association committees still inspected invoices and eased disputes. In New England, families displaced by the Boston siege rebuilt houses and reopened shops. In Canada's borderlands, carpenters laid keels for small vessels under Benedict Arnold's eye, understanding that a handful of gunboats might buy a winter. In the South, Charleston celebrated its reprieve and kept watch seaward. And in the middle colonies, where the war was about to swell, men counted cartridges by candlelight while the city around them listened to the creak of artillery carriages moving to their posts. The ring of entrenchments that had begun the year on frozen Dorchester slopes had expanded into a broader geometry. Fleets, fort lines, committee rooms, and a parchment that redefined what victory would mean. Before dawn on August 22nd, 1776, boats began to shuttle silently from the Great Fleet to the sandy reaches of Long Island. Oars rose and fell, marines steadied the craft, grenadiers stepped into the surf and formed on the beach. By daybreak, the British Army, regulars in scarlet, Hessian auxiliaries in blue and green, light infantry and companies of flankers, stood on ground that faced the wooded ridge running from the Narrows toward Jamaica, the last barrier before the fields behind Brooklyn. Across those heights, the American advance line watched from scattered posts linked by country lanes and split rail fences, their main entrenchments sitting back nearer the village, where fresh-dug earth parapets and abatis were anchored on the East River. Washington had divided his strength, a portion in Manhattan guarding expected landings, and several brigades under Israel Putnam, John Sullivan, and Lord Stirling forward on Long Island to feel for the enemy. The outpost line stretched thin. It guarded the obvious passes, Gowanus Road and Flatbush Road, but the less traveled Jamaica Pass, farther to the east, lay under the eyes of a handful of militia men in the good faith of the woods. The British plan exploited that seam. On the night of August 26th to 27th, a strong column under General Henry Clinton and General William Howe stepped off long before midnight, guided by loyalist farmers who knew every cart track that threaded the thickets. They moved quietly through Jamaica Pass, turned the American left without being seen, and at dawn were in the rear of the outpost line. To the south, General James Grant pressed against Stirling along the coast road with noisy demonstrations. In the center, Hessians under von Heister pushed up from Flatbush against Sullivan. The feint, the pressure, and the hidden march converged with the first full light. What followed was a battle in pieces. On the American right, Stirling held his men near the Gowanus with discipline that stiffened every low wall. When the turn fell on them from the rear, he recognized at once that only a stand could buy time. He led a small detachment back against the old stone house, drawing fire, fixing the British momentarily, while most of his brigade splashed and scrambled across the marshy creek to the safety of the Brooklyn lines. Stirling was captured. Many others fell or were taken in the tangle south of the ridge. In the center, Sullivan's troops, pressed hard by Hessian bayonets and turned from behind by Clinton's column, broke under the weight. Sullivan himself was captured in the confusion. Along the roads, small knots of men fought withdrawal battles tree to tree and fence to fence. But by mid-morning, the outpost line had collapsed in segments, and the survivors were falling back toward the redoubts nearer the river. Washington, who had crossed from Manhattan in the night, saw enough from the heights behind the works to understand both the scope of the danger and the restraint with which the British commander was now acting. Howe brought his army forward to within cannon shot, then began to dig, preferring a formal approach to another costly frontal assault. The American position was strong so long as boats could move on the East River. The British position was strong, so long as the river could be made a trap. For 2 days the army stared at each other across gun smoke in the shallow arc of no man's land. Washington decided he would not wait for a siege to tighten. On the stormy night of August 29th to 30th, while batteries on the lines barked at intervals to cover sound, boatmen, many of them fishermen from Marblehead under Colonel John Glover, began to ferry the army back to Manhattan. Units filed down to the shore in ordered silence, stacked arms on command, and stepped into craft that disappeared into the darkness. Horses, cannon, wagons, everything that could go, went. A wind that had vexed movement earlier fell to a calm. Toward dawn, a fog rose off the river and settled over the Brooklyn shore, veiling the last embarkations while the Manhattan bank stayed oddly clear. By sunrise, pickets left behind to mask the withdrawal slipped down to the water and found boats waiting for them. When British skirmishers finally advanced, they looked into empty works and fresh footprints in the sand. The army had been lifted whole. Between battle and pursuit, there was an attempt at talk. On September 11th, 3 American delegates, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Edward Rutledge, met Admiral Lord Howe on Staten Island. The conversation was courteous and brief. Howe could offer pardons and adjustments under the old constitutional frame. The delegates could only speak for a people who had 1 week earlier heard independence read to regiments on parade. They parted without agreement, each side more certain that force would answer what words could not. Force returned to the city. On September the 15th, British transports nosed in toward Kipps Bay on the east side of Manhattan and loosed boats packed with light infantry. Naval guns raked the shoreline. The militia posted there broke and ran under the blast. Washington rode into the rout, furious and exposed, trying to steady men who would not stand before staff officers pulled him clear. The army fell back northward in uneven files. The next day, along the high ground of Harlem Heights, an American counterstroke, launched by light troops under Thomas Knowlton and reinforced by Maryland and Virginia regiments, pushed British skirmishers back in a sharp fight that steadied nerves and gave the army something it badly needed: proof that on equal ground it could drive the enemy a little way. Howe tried the flank again in October, sending columns eastward by water to Throg's Neck. The marsh and a narrow causeway stopped him. American detachments pulled up planks, felled trees, and made the landing worthless. He shifted a few miles north to Pell's Point on October 18th and came ashore there, only to be met by Glover's brigade, posted behind stone walls in successive lines. A deliberate, staged withdrawal under fire slowed the British enough for Washington to slip the main body up into Westchester County to the field around White Plains. There, on October the 28th, the two armies felt for each other along the Bronx River and a rocky hill called Chatterton. Hessians went forward with precision. American militia on the slopes yielded to pressure. Continental brigades traded volleys and withdrew with order that had been learned the hard way. Washington pulled his force back toward North Castle that night, conserving men rather than testing strong positions with weak hands. Howe, rather than press into the hills, turned south again. Manhattan still held an American strong point on the Hudson. Fort Washington, whose commander believed, as did General Nathaniel Greene across the river, that the post could be held and should be. On November the 16th, British and Hessian troops attacked Fort Washington from multiple directions after a demand for its surrender was refused. Assault columns forced the outer works. The garrison, cut and pressed, fell back toward the central redoubt. By afternoon, with casualties mounting and no relief possible, Colonel Robert Margot surrendered. Nearly 3,000 Americans were taken prisoner. Sorely needed arms and stores were lost. 4 days later, with British forces crossing the river above him, Greene evacuated Fort Lee opposite and retired westward, leaving tents, kettles, and baggage in a hurried scramble up the palisades as enemy light troops climbed a steep path from the landing below. The next weeks became a measured retreat across New Jersey that tested endurance more than tactics. Cornwallis, with a mobile advance, pressed from behind. Washington fell back from Newark to New Brunswick, from New Brunswick to Princeton, and from Princeton to Trenton, sending urgent letters ahead for militia, calling for men whose enlistments would soon expire to stay a little longer, and ordering boats gathered on the Delaware. On December 8th, the last detachments ferried over to the Pennsylvania bank and the army burned or carried away the craft. British outposts settled along the east bank, at Trenton, at Bordentown, at Burlington. Thin lines of pickets in a countryside where some welcomed them and others did not. Numbers shrank with every mile. Men slipped away as enlistments ended. Shoes wore out. Smallpox took its quiet toll despite inoculation in some regiments. Pay chests ran light and late. In mid-December, a small thing with outsized effect moved through campfires and taverns alike. Thomas Paine's new pamphlet, printed first in Philadelphia, opening with a sentence that men repeated to one another by rote before they knew they believed it. The words did not feed anyone, but they stiffened spines. Washington, facing the river ice and the calendar, wrote that unless something were done quickly, the cause might dissolve. Behind the lines, politics and supply still moved. Congress, having authorized independence in July, had fled Philadelphia for Baltimore when the Delaware line became a front, carrying ledgers and the seal to safer rooms. Committees of safety in the counties tried to keep flour moving to depots and to count muskets that were never quite enough. Far to the north, on Lake Champlain, the defensive fleet thrown together under Benedict Arnold had been beaten at Valcour Island in October, but had delayed the British long enough to close the season, buying months that would matter in another year. In Boston, families who had returned after the evacuation built shutters for windows that winter would rattle. In Charleston, the Palmetto Fort's scars weathered into stories. Along the Delaware's west bank, sentries stamped their feet in the cold and watched for lamps across the water where German auxiliaries held Trenton. Flatboats lay hidden in creeks and behind wooded bends. Officers who, a year earlier, had learned to manage a siege on a hill now measured tides and wind and the time it takes to form an assault column in the dark. The army that had escaped across a river in August now sat behind another river in December, thinned and quiet, waiting for a night when weather and will might line up in its favor. The question that had begun as an argument over duties and paper had become, at the close of 1776, whether a fragile new claim to nationhood could survive the winter between an enemy's outposts and an empty muster roll. The river answered first. On the afternoon of December the 25th, 1776, orders went out along the Pennsylvania bank for quiet, for discipline, for men to pack only what they must. 3 columns were planned to cross the Delaware that night, one under Nathaniel Greene and John Sullivan with Washington at McConkey's Ferry, aiming straight for Trenton. A second under James Ewing to seize the bridges nearer the town. A third under John Cadwallader to threaten the garrisons downriver. Ice floes ground along the black water. A sleet storm drove from the northeast and turned the banks to glass. When the password moved down the lines, victory or death, it was less a flourish than a reminder that the enlistments in many regiments expired at month's end and that a failure now might empty the ranks by New Year. Only Washington's column made the far shore. Ewing's boats were forced back by ice. Cadwallader crossed part of his infantry but could not bring the guns over and returned to Pennsylvania. Washington's 2 brigades, about 2,400 men in all, with 18 field pieces, took all night to cross. Henry Knox oversaw the artillery, easing guns into Durham boats, holding teams steady as ice struck hulls and oars thudded against floes. The march began long after schedule, 2 columns feeling their way over frozen ruts and stony lanes. Greene's men on the Pennington Road, Sullivan's down the River Road. Snow turned to needle rain, then back to snow. The storm blew in their faces, which was a mercy. The wind smothered sound and drove against the Hessian sentries too. Just after first light on December 26th, pickets fired and fell back into Trenton. Colonel Johann Rall's brigade, 3 regiments of Hessian infantry with outposts scattered along the approaches, roused to drums in streets that ran like gullies between low houses. Washington rode up King Street with artillery unlimbered at intersections. Knox's guns hammered crossfires into the town. Sullivan's column entered from the south, closing the pinch. Fighting lasted minutes rather than hours. Stubborn pockets near the churchyard, a rally in an orchard that failed when Washington's guns turned, an order to regroup that arrived after the trap had closed. Rall, mortally wounded, yielded his sword. Roughly 900 prisoners and 6 guns were taken. American dead numbered only a handful. By late morning, columns of prisoners with fixed bayonets at their backs were already moving down the icy road toward the ferry. Washington recrossed to Pennsylvania with what he had won, for the river was as much an ally as any brigade. Reaction was immediate. British detachments pulled inward. Cornwallis, recalled from leave, gathered troops at Princeton and New Brunswick. Washington, sensing the swing of the pendulum, moved back over the Delaware on December the 29th and placed his army behind Assunpink Creek at Trenton, bridges watched by cannon, approaches studded with pickets. New men arrived whose enlistments began with the new year. Others whose time had run out were persuaded by bounties and words to stay a little longer. The militia of New Jersey, encouraged by the capture at Trenton, took to the roads again. Skirmishes snapped at foraging parties and posts that had seemed secure a week before. On January the 2nd, 1777, the second act opened. Cornwallis marched out of Princeton with roughly 8,000 men, drums and fifes and the cold. The American screen yielded by design, fighting at crossroads and fence lines to buy minutes. By late afternoon, the British vanguard reached the stone bridge over Assunpink Creek. 3 times they tried the crossings. 3 times Washington's guns, speaking from the bank and infantry behind rails, sent them back. Dusk drew down. Fires rose on the American side as if for a night's bivouac. Cornwallis told his staff the morning would do. Washington did not intend to wait for morning. After council, with guides who knew the back roads, he sent teams to keep campfires fed, wagons lined up where the army might seem to be, and orders to muffle wheels and march. At midnight, the column filed off the Quaker Bridge Road, swinging south and then east around the British left, moving through orchard and byre with the bite of frost in the air and gun carriages wrapped in rags. The plan was audacious and simple. Leave the enemy facing an empty line at dawn, appear on the Princeton Road behind him, break the smaller garrison there, and threaten the magazines at New Brunswick beyond. The morning of January 3rd broke with the crackle of surprise. On the fields south of Princeton near Stony Brook, Colonel Mawhood's regiments, elements of the 17th, 40th, and 50th, were marching toward Trenton when they met the American advance. The first American line, largely militia, wavered under disciplined volleys. In the orchard to the west, Brigadier General Hugh Mercer fell, bayoneted and left for dead. For a day he was mistaken for Washington himself. The line rippled. Units began to give ground. Then Washington rode in, placing himself between lines at a distance that made aides cover their faces. He rallied the men with the blunt language of work. Dress your ranks, give them the fire, until the line steadied and delivered volleys close enough to whiten faces with powder. Knox's guns came up again. Their practice at street corners in Trenton now turned on open fields. Mawhood cut his way to the south with part of his command. Other detachments fell back toward the village and into Nassau Hall itself, where a few shells through the windows ended the last pocket of resistance. Washington wanted New Brunswick and its stores, but fatigue, the roads, and reports of the enemy closing dictated prudence. He turned north and west through Somerset Courthouse and the hills, carrying his prisoners along rutted roads toward the Watchung Range. From there, he could menace the enemy's posts and choose his ground. Cornwallis, reaching an abandoned camp at Trenton in the morning light, found only ashes and footprints. He wheeled his columns north and arrived at Princeton to see American rearguards disappearing into the uplands. Those 10 days, from the night crossing to the fight at Princeton, changed the war's arithmetic. British detachments fell back to a tighter cordon anchored on New Brunswick and Perth Amboy. Loyalist recruitment in New Jersey, vigorous in December, withered in January. Militia who had kept hides and grain close now brought them out again when American patrols passed. In London, the news arrived damp from the bags and cooled the talk of a rebellion nearly subdued. In Philadelphia, and in farm kitchens along the Delaware, the same news braced men to sign on when recruiters came down the lane. Winter did not bring stillness. It brought a different fight. From January through March 1777, the Forage War ran up and down central New Jersey. British parties sent out to gather hay, grain, and cattle found fences empty because neighbors had driven stock into woods and swamps. When wagons did form up, militia and Continental light troops worked in small detachments to snap at the flanks and melt away. Skirmishes at Millstone, where Jersey troops under Philemon Dickinson struck a foraging convoy and pushed it off the river ice near Van Nest's mill. At Spanktown, at Somerset Courthouse, and at dozens of unnamed crossroads bled wagons and spirit. In April, a sharper blow fell at Bound Brook, where a British column surprised an American outpost and forced a rapid withdrawal. A reminder that the larger army still cast a long shadow. The pattern held. Strong posts at the coast, an American army in the hills, a countryside that learned to look at uniforms and decide whether to hide or to help in the minute it takes a column to pass. Behind the lines, Washington used the winter's pause to change vulnerabilities into routines. Smallpox, which had ravaged the northern expedition the year before, could no longer be left to chance. In February 1777, he ordered systematic inoculation for Continental recruits and, as logistics allowed, for the line, using variolation in controlled cycles so that units were out of action only as long as the fever ran its course. Hospitals were set up away from main camps. Surgeons kept registers of the pitted and the spared. The policy was not a notice in a gazette. It was lists on tables, surgeons at work, watches posted to keep curiosity and infection from undoing the benefit. Over the months that followed, disease loosened its grip enough that the army could plan without counting on contagion to ruin its own plans. Congress, which had decamped to Baltimore when the fighting pressed toward Philadelphia, returned to the city in March. Committees that had learned to act like ministries filled their hours, provisions, powder, cloth, transport. State governments solidified. New constitutions drafted in the rush of 1776 began to feel like laws rather than experiments. New York would adopt its in April 1777 with a governor and a Senate and Assembly fashioned to the province's particular temper. Pennsylvania's single-house government, created the previous summer, found itself tested by committees of safety and by people who had only recently learned to use town meeting as a lever. The paper money Congress issued, Continentals, passed from hand to hand with trust that varied mile by mile. Privateers, licensed in admiralty courts that now sat under state seals as well as congressional authority, widened the war at sea by making British insurance dearer and merchant captains cautious. Across the ocean, the diplomacy that would shape the war's next phases began to assemble its furniture. Silas Deane's entreaties in Paris gained a colleague when Benjamin Franklin arrived in December 1776, wrapped in a fur cap that became a kind of uniform in Salon. With Arthur Lee joining them, the American commissioners dealt with France's foreign minister, Vergennes, and with a private trading house, Roderigue Hortalet and Tilly, that laundered royal support into crates marked with false consignors and true contents, muskets, powder, cloth, and engineers. Nothing was certain yet. Everything was possible. Each ship that left a French port carrying supplies for America was a risk. Each arrival in a colonial harbor meant men who might otherwise go without cartridges now had them. British dispositions for the spring took shape under two plans that would not agree. In Canada, General John Burgoyne prepared to descend from the lakes to Albany, intent on cutting New England off from the middle colonies by way of the Hudson Valley. In New York, General William Howe looked south toward Philadelphia, the seat of Congress and a harbor his fleet could reach. He wrote of an overland advance up the New Jersey corridor or movement by sea to the Chesapeake or the Delaware. The logic that the two armies should meet at Albany read well on paper. The decisions that would be made between June and August would set the columns on different roads. In New Jersey, Washington used ground to answer numbers. He put his army into the hills, at Morristown first, then later at Middlebrook, screened by the Watchung Mountains and with roads that ran down like spokes to the Raritan and the Plain. From there, he could watch the enemy at New Brunswick and Perth Amboy, move to threaten any inland thrust and hide his true strength in the folds of terrain. Engineers measured distances to fords. Patrols learned tavern names like waypoints on a map. Dispatch riders practiced the routes that would matter when columns began to move in heat rather than in sleet. Not all the fighting ran east and west. In December 1776, the British had seized Newport, Rhode Island, establishing a garrison in Narragansett Bay that would complicate American and, later, French naval plans for years. New England sent militia to contain the post and to keep its foraging within bounds. The war worked itself into every map. A thread of outposts on the New Jersey shore, a knot at Newport, a line of watchfires inland from New York Harbor, and long, thin arcs where privateers sailed into winter seas looking for prizes. Through late winter and early spring, daily life in the army settled into a pattern that men would remember as decisive in its own way. Drills formed by the hourglass. Cartridge boxes were inspected and re-inspected. Quartermasters argued over shoes. Officers learned to post guards not only against the enemy, but against temptation. Storehouses and herds that had to feed an army through March and April without stirring the anger of neighbors whose support mattered more than any one day's rations. Courts martial met to hear cases of plunder and desertion. Sentences, sometimes harsh, were calibrated to make examples without ruining regiments. From Morristown, orders went out that read like both military memoranda and civil instruction. Keep the roads open, protect the mills, bring in stragglers, return the sick to depots prepared for their recovery instead of leaving them to drift. The winter's debates reached into towns too and made politics practical. Committees of inspection, formed to enforce the Continental Association in 1774, adapted to war. They resolved disputes over prices when scarcity raised tempers. They mediated quarrels born of long acquaintance and sudden politics. Loyalist families weighed exile or declared neutrality. Some took paroles to remain on farms if they promised not to aid the enemy. Others slipped behind British lines to Amboy or New York and found life there harder than they had imagined. New Jersey, caught between armies, made few things simple. When the roads dried and the grass came in, outposts edged closer and patrols stepped out farther. British columns tested the North Jersey passes and drew back. American detachments struck a picket line and vanished into oak scrub. Howe shifted his men by water toward Staten Island, toward Sandy Hook, toward the places from which a fleet could fan out to either river mouth. In Canada, Burgoyne loaded bateaux. In Paris, Franklin exhausted the art of patience by practice, cultivating sympathy now and calculation later. What had begun on river ice had ended for the season, with an army that believed in itself again. The winter had been used to fight small where large was impossible, to make the sick strong by order rather than chance, to build structures of government that could carry weight for more than a month, and to station a force where it could see first and move fast. Ahead lay a year in which two campaigns, one down the lakes and one toward a capital, would try to draw the same map into two different shapes. For the moment, the tents at Morristown stood in orderly streets. The watch at the gaps changed on time, and dispatch riders waited with fresh horses for the signal drum that would send them toward crossroads where, very soon, decisions would again be made before breakfast. Spring came on in 1777, with pickets facing one another across New Jersey's creeks and causeways, and with plans on both sides that looked neat on paper. In New York, General William Howe kept his main force around New Brunswick and Perth Amboy, making short thrusts to feel out the roads toward the Watchung Range where Washington's army lay in the hills at Middlebrook. In Canada, a separate army under Lieutenant General John Burgoyne assembled at the head of Lake Champlain to move south toward the Hudson Valley. In London, ministers endorsed a design that imagined those two efforts converging at Albany. Burgoyne would come down the lakes, Colonel Barry Street. Leger would descend the Mohawk to meet him, and Howe, moving up from New York, would close the hinge. It was a tidy geometry. The ground and the decisions of men separated by rivers and weeks would not keep it tidy for long. Before the big columns moved, smaller blows fell. In April, British troops and loyalists under William Tryon raided Danbury, Connecticut, to destroy Continental stores. Militia turned out under Generals David Wooster, Benedict Arnold, and Gold Silliman, striking the retiring column at Ridgefield and along the roads to the coast. The stores were lost, but the skirmishing showed again how quickly New England towns could put men on a lane and make a retreat expensive. In New Jersey through May and June, Howe felt for Washington's flanks, pushing probes toward the gaps and fords. A hard fight near Short Hills at the end of June, and the ground itself convinced him that a straight march inland would not give him the decision he wanted. By mid-July, his army re-embarked. Whether he meant first to ascend the Hudson or to strike at Philadelphia by sea would be known, to friend and foe alike, only when his sails showed again. North of the lakes, Burgoyne's force, British regulars, German auxiliaries from Brunswick and Hesse-Hanau under Friedrich von Riedesel, Canadians, Loyalists, and native allies, pushed off with confidence. In early July, with guns mounted on the height the Americans had not fortified, Sugarloaf, which the British called Mount Defiance, Fort Ticonderoga was no longer tenable. General Arthur St. Clair withdrew the garrison on the night of July 5th to 6th. The retreat cost men and material. Hubbardton on July 7th saw British light infantry and grenadiers under Simon Fraser, reinforced by Riedesel's Germans, catch the American rear guard under Seth Warner in a hot fight that ended in American withdrawal, and it set a pattern. Burgoyne would advance as far as his wagons and bateaux could feed him. The Americans would trade space for time and look for the places where that column could be cut. That place first appeared at Bennington. Burdened by long supply lines and short on draft animals, Burgoyne sent a detachment of Germans, Loyalists, and native auxiliaries under Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Baum eastward into the New Hampshire grants to seize horses, cattle, and flour. New Hampshire militia gathered under John Stark. A detachment of Green Mountain men under Warner joined him. On August 16th, they attacked in coordinated parts, swinging on flanks through woods and fields, and overran Baum's position after stubborn resistance, then turned on a relief column under Breyman and drove it back as well. The victory cost Burgoyne irreplaceable men and animals and stiffened militia across New England. It also signaled to native allies that this campaign's risks might outweigh its rewards. Many left the British camp in the weeks that followed. On the Mohawk line, St. Leger's auxiliary expedition met its own friction. In August, he brought British regulars, Loyalists under John Butler, and a large native contingent led in part by Joseph Brant, to lay siege to Fort Stanwix, Fort Schuyler, which garrison commander Peter Gansevoort held with determined economy. Militia under Nicholas Herkimer, marching to relieve the fort, were ambushed at Oriskany on August 6th in a brutal close-quarters fight, one of the war's bloodiest, where smoke, rain, and forest turned formations into knots. Herkimer, mortally wounded, kept directing his men. Both sides broke off, battered. A few days later, Benedict Arnold, sent north with a small relief force, used a ruse, spreading word through captured Loyalists that a large American column was at hand to scatter St. Leger's native allies. The siege collapsed. With the Mohawk prong gone and the Bennington detachment cut, Burgoyne would press on alone. While the northern line tightened, Howe's course resolved. After feints up the Hudson's lower reaches, his fleet stood out from Sandy Hook at the end of July and after a long, hot passage, appeared in late August in the upper Chesapeake at Head of Elk. He aimed for Philadelphia. Washington marched south and west to interpose along the approaches from that quarter, placing his line on the Brandywine, a tangle of fords and meadows northwest of the city. There, on September 11th, Howe used the same combination that had undone the American line on Long Island. A demonstration in front and a long turning march on a lesser-watched ford. Lieutenant General Wilhelm von Kniphausen pressed at Chad's Ford while Lord Cornwallis led the flanking column upstream, crossed at unguarded points, and came down on the right near the Birmingham Meeting House. Misreported positions, dust, and the sheer breadth of the ground left Washington's commanders reacting a beat too late. The day ended with a hard American retreat toward Chester, fighting in stands that prevented a rout but left the road to Philadelphia open. In the days that followed, sharp night work at Paoli added a different note. On September the 20th to 21st, British light infantry under Charles Grey, attacking with bayonets and muskets unloaded to prevent a betraying flash, struck Anthony Wayne's division near the Paoli Tavern. The blow scattered the camp and left dead in the dark, whose wounds fed an American sense of outrage. The Paoli massacre, in later telling, useful to recruiting and to resolve. On September the 26th, British troops entered Philadelphia. Congress had already moved west to Lancaster and then across the Susquehanna to York. Washington, unwilling to leave the matter there, struck back at Germantown on October 4th with a plan that required multiple columns to reach their objectives in fog and at speed. The attack opened with promise, drove through outlying posts, and then jammed on a hard point, Cliveden, the Chew House, whose stone walls and disciplined fire stalled one wing, while confusion in the mist led to American units firing on one another. A British counterstroke cleared the village. The field was lost. The impression abroad that the American army could take the offensive against a superior force was not. Along the Delaware, forts and shoals tried to give the city back to the countryside. Fort Mercer at Red Bank on the New Jersey shore and Fort Mifflin on Mud Island guarded the river with guns and a line of chevaux de frise set below the water. On October the 22nd, a Hessian column under Colonel Carl von Donop assaulted Red Bank and was repulsed with heavy loss. Von Donop was mortally wounded. British ships fighting their way up to support the effort suffered as well. HMS Augusta exploded and burned after running aground. Fort Mifflin endured a sustained bombardment in November that shattered its works. The garrison slipped away at night when walls could no longer be held. Fort Mercer was evacuated days later when British troops crossed the river above it. By late November, the river was open. Howe's army in Philadelphia could be fed by water. North again, Burgoyne had crossed the Hudson to the west bank near Saratoga and found his way barred. American forces under Philip Schuyler had traded miles for preparations all summer, felling trees, flooding roads, burning bridges. By September, Horatio Gates, newly given command in the north, sat on strong ground at Bemis Heights south of Saratoga, his lines designed by the Polish engineer Tadeusz Kościuszko to dominate the river road and the broken country to its west. Riflemen under Daniel Morgan and New England brigades under Benedict Arnold's aggressive eye gave the position bite beyond its parapets. Burgoyne, needing to break through before weather and supplies closed his choices, attacked on September 19th at Freeman's Farm. The day became a series of deadly, close-range firefights in woods and clearings where Morgan's rifles in New Hampshire and New York Continentals met British brigades under Fraser and Riedesel. The British held a part of the field at dusk, but paid a price in officers and men they could not afford. Stalemate favors the side with shorter lines. Burgoyne's shortened hourglass kept running. A relief column under Sir Henry Clinton did move up the lower Hudson in early October, storming the river forts at the Highlands, Montgomery and Clinton, and burning at Kingston, but it did not reach far enough north to help. On October the 7th, Burgoyne tried again, sending a reconnaissance in force to test the American left. The Americans seized the initiative. In the afternoon, fighting remembered as Bemis Heights, they struck in coordinated rushes that unhinged the probe and then rolled it up. Arnold, officially relieved in a quarrel with Gates but still near the field, rode out, rallied units, and led assaults that cracked the German redoubt under Breyman's command. He fell wounded, his leg shattered, in the moment of success. That night, Burgoyne pulled back toward Saratoga. His lines contracted along the river with Americans closing in. On October 17th, 1777, he surrendered his army under terms, the Convention of Saratoga, that allowed his men to march to Massachusetts as prisoners with the expectation of eventual exchange. Congress would later dispute that convention and keep the convention army under guard longer than first agreed. The immediate effect did not depend on later legalities. An entire British army had been taken in the field. That fact traveled west across the Atlantic in dispatches and rumors, and east to Paris in confidential letters and public talk. In France, where sympathies had already become subsidies, moved through a private house and a public wink, ministers read the news against their calculations about war with Britain. American commissioners, Silas Deane, Arthur Lee, and most visibly Benjamin Franklin, found doors that had been politely closed now opening farther. Before winter's end, diplomacy would catch up with the battlefield. In Pennsylvania, winter began sooner than any treaty. In December, Washington took his army to winter quarters at Valley Forge, 20 miles from the city, close enough to watch. far enough to breathe. Shelter had to be made as much as found. Men felled trees, raised huts in regular streets, and learned to live by ration returns and requisitions. Commissaries struggled against broken wagons and thin credit. Roads turned to mud between cold snaps and baked hard between storms. Shortages were real, shoes worn through, shirts reduced to rags. But so were the structures that the year had begun to build. Inspectors who checked deliveries. Quartermasters who learned which routes would hold a team in January. Surgeons who ran inoculation schedules instead of letting smallpox choose its own times. In February, a Prussian-born former staff officer named Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben arrived, and, within weeks, began the work of turning drills from habits learned company by company to a common grammar. That would matter when spring opened. The Philadelphia campaign, for all its marches and smoke, had not ended an army. Howe had taken a capital. He had not taken the force that made the capital matter. Saratoga, far to the north, had done something different. It had shifted the war's balance in a way Allies could see on a map. In New Jersey, the months after the 10-day turn at Trenton and Princeton had taught militia how to turn a broad enemy into wagons on a narrow road. In New England and New York, the summer had taught engineers how to make ground do work and riflemen how to use that work to bloody a line. In Europe that winter, diplomats and ministers moved toward the step that would make the title of this story literal. France would not simply sell muskets and powder, it would make war. The formalities were close. Papers drawn to bind trade and alliance, calculations about fleets in the Channel and sugar islands in the Caribbean, a reckoning about Spain's likely course. When the news crossed the ocean in the new year, it would change British priorities, open new theaters, and make the next June's decisions along the New Jersey roads as much about ships in distant seas as about fields near a meeting house. For the moment, the camps were quiet by the standards that had ruled the year. In Philadelphia, British officers held assemblies and kept patrols out to keep the countryside at bay. In the huts along the Schuylkill, men learned to wheel by battalion on a frozen parade ground and to keep their powder dry no matter what the weather made of their chimney smoke. North and west, the prisoners taken at Saratoga tramped on frozen ruts toward barracks where they would spend a long captivity. In Paris, a fur cap and a smile that played to a room did their work. The coming spring would carry two messages at once: that an army which had survived a second winter would meet its old adversary again on more equal terms, and that the argument which had started with attacks at a wharf would now be measured in fleets that wore different flags. Winter loosened its grip at Valley Forge, not with a single thaw, but with a slow turn toward order. Huts stood in regular streets. Returns began to match reality. Barrels of flour and salt meat arrived in tighter rhythms. In February 1778, a compact, energetic officer from Europe, Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, set to work on the parade ground. He drilled a model company himself, then used it to teach captains and sergeants how to move a battalion as one. Files dressing straight, priming and loading by count, wheeling into line without confusion, marching fast, and then stopping clean. What began as a language problem, orders shouted in French and German, translated on the fly, became a grammar the whole army could learn. Washington's staff, enlarged and steadier than the winter before, folded those lessons into daily routine. In March, Nathaniel Greene took over the battered quartermaster department and started untangling wagons, depots, and contracts. The Army's world: drill in the morning, cutting wood at midday, repair in the afternoon, grew predictable enough that men could imagine the spring campaign and live to see it. News reached camp that made the routine feel like preface. On February 6, 1778, in Paris, American commissioners and the French crown signed 2 treaties, one of amity and commerce, another of alliance. France recognized the United States and promised war if Britain tried to stop the trade that recognition implied. It was a decision made from calculation as well as sympathy, revenge for 1763, prospects in the Caribbean, the chance to check a rival's sea power, but for men in huts it meant 2 things at once: supplies in deeper streams and the promise of fleets under a friendly flag. Britain answered by treating the new alliance as an act of war. What had begun as a colonial revolt was now an international conflict. London tried words once more before ships moved. Parliament repealed old revenue acts in gesture and empowered a commission, headed by the Earl of Carlisle, to offer concessions: self-taxation under Parliament's supremacy, amnesty, adjustments to trade. The terms did not include independence. Congress, meeting again in Philadelphia after the winter's flight, replied with courtesy and refusal. The same spring, another change arrived. General William Howe asked to be relieved and sailed for England. Sir Henry Clinton took command with orders to consolidate, pull troops from exposed posts, and prepare for a wider war. That wider war reached American waters in July when the Comte d'Estaing's French fleet appeared off the coast. But before sails on the horizon could affect the ground, Clinton obeyed his orders at hand. In June, he evacuated Philadelphia, baggage wagons strung out for miles, loyalist families and carts of supplies among them, and set his army marching overland for New York. Washington moved from Valley Forge to shadow him along the Jersey roads, the 2 columns drawing together in heat that blistered feet and split canteens. They met at Monmouth Courthouse on June 28, 1778, the hottest day many men would ever remember. Washington sent Charles Lee with the advance to strike the British rear. Confusion in the morning, mixed orders, dust, and pressure from a turning movement sent Lee's force falling back. Washington rode forward and found men flowing the wrong way through knolls and hedgerows. He steadied the line. Wayne anchoring with infantry, Knox's guns brought up at the trot, Greene holding the right on commanding ground. Sterling's division dug in, where the enemy would have to spend blood to move them. Von Steuben's winter lessons showed. Ranks dressed instead of dissolving. Fire delivered by volley at close range. The left and right refusing in turn. The day ended with the British lines intact, but checked. The fields littered more from heat than bullets. Through the night, Clinton withdrew to the safety of Sandy Hook and British warships. The result was indecisive on paper and decisive in memory. The army that had run on the East River 2 summers earlier had traded blows. In the open, then stood. The alliance reached for its first combined blow that summer at Newport. D'Estaing brought his fleet to Narragansett Bay in August to cooperate with American troops under John Sullivan against the British garrison at Newport, Rhode Island. Plans were laid to trap the defenders by land and sea. British ships under Howe arrived to challenge the French. A gale, more than a gale, a late summer tempest scattered both fleets, dismasted ships, and turned turn decks into wreckage. D'Estaing, short of masts and powder, chose to refit at Boston. Sullivan's army, exposed without the fleet, withdrew under pressure after a sharp action on August 29th, remembered as the Battle of Rhode Island. Lafayette helped keep order. Tempers flared between allies and cooled again with letters and dinners. It was an early lesson in coalition war. Goodwill could not make weather or carpentry obey. Elsewhere, the war moved along older lines, raids and counter-raids, outposts struck and rebuilt. On the Hudson, engineers under Tadeusz Kościuszko strengthened West Point and strung a great chain across the river to make a passage costly. In New Jersey, the forage war resumed by habit. British wagons went out with strong escorts. Militia kept to the edges, striking where fences and streams favored them. In the political rooms behind the lines, a winter's murmurs against Washington, the so-called Conway cabal, ran out of oxygen. Thomas Conway resigned after wounds and scandal, and the Board of War lost the confidence it had never fully earned. Washington's authority, tested in snow and gossip both, emerged steadier than it had been in the fall. Frontier lines burned hot. In July 1778, in the Wyoming Valley along the Susquehanna, a column of Loyalists and Iroquois under John Butler and allied chiefs routed local militia. Killings during and after the battle left a deep scar in Pennsylvania's memory. In November, at Cherry Valley in New York, an attack led by Walter Butler and Joseph Brant broke through weak defenses and resulted in civilian deaths that the American press called a massacre. These events convinced Washington that, when troops could be spared, a sustained expedition would be needed to break the network of raiding bases and restore some measure of security to the border. Plans began that winter for a campaign the next year under John Sullivan and James Clinton. The frontier, unvisited by armies large enough to hold it, learned again the cost of being fought over by neighbors and distant patrons alike. To the west, on a different frontier, George Rogers Clark carried Virginia's flag into the Illinois country. In July, he took Kaskaskia without a shot, then Cahokia, persuading French-speaking inhabitants to accept American allegiance. His small forces' presence along the Mississippi and at the edge of the Wabash loosened British control and threatened the chain of posts that connected Detroit to the Ohio. In February 1779, he would carry that work to Vincennes through flood and frost. But the campaign's start belongs to 1778's summer, when a handful of men changed a map by moving quietly and quickly where larger armies could not. At sea, the fight widened by a measure of imagination. In April 1778, John Paul Jones in Ranger harried the Irish Sea, raided Whitehaven, and captured HMS Drake off Carrickfergus in a gunnery duel fought close enough for voices to carry. The scale was small, the echo large. British coastal towns that had watched war only in gazettes now looked for it on their own horizons. Farther afield that same summer, French and British fleets met in the Channel off Ushant in an indecisive battle that nonetheless forced Britain to keep more ships nearer home. In the Caribbean, the alliance turned sugar islands into prizes. The French seized Dominica in September. The British took St. Lucia in December after a hard fight that D'Estaing's battered ships could not prevent. Each change of flag moved trade and insurance rates and reminded every cabinet that the war now ran on two oceans. Inside British-held New York, life settled into the strained normal of a garrisoned port. Loyalist regiments drilled, merchants shipped under convoy, British headquarters kept watch on rivers and roads. Across the lines in New Jersey, Washington posted his army for the winter at the Middlebrook encampment, close enough to contest any inland thrust, far enough to keep supplies moving and discipline steady. Courts-martial met, not to make examples only, but to remind companies that order was a habit. Von Steuben refined his drill into a manual, the Blue Book, simple in form, quickly learned, and portable from regiment to regiment. Men who had practiced by the Count at Valley Forge now saw their practice hardened across a full campaign season and written down for those who would arrive next spring. Political weather in occupied and newly recovered cities shifted as well. In Philadelphia, Benedict Arnold, still lame from Saratoga, took the military governorship and made enemies as swiftly as he bought fine goods. Accusations about profiteering and misuse of authority gathered. A court-martial would be ordered the next year. For the moment, the episode showed how war and commerce in a city could tangle reputations beyond easy repair. In Boston, the French fleet's presence for refit brought ceremonies and frictions, dinners and duels, and a gradual learning by both sides of what this alliance required in patience and in pride. Late in the year, British strategy bent south. With New York secure and Newport held, with the Northern Army lost at Saratoga, and a French war demanding regiments for the islands, London judged that royal authority could be rebuilt from the Carolinas and Georgia upward, where loyalist strength seemed greater and plantation ports promised supplies. In November, orders were cut. In December, a British expedition under Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Campbell sailed for the Savannah River. On December 29, 1778, his troops landed below the town, outflanked the American line, and took Savannah with prisoners and guns to match. Brigadier General Augustine Prevost pushed up from East Florida to join him. A British foothold in Georgia, firm and anchored on a deep water port, was the year's last new fact. Winter. 1778 to 1779 settled in unevenly across those threads. Along the Hudson, the great chain held the river fast beneath snow. At Middlebrook, huts went up again, better built than the last winters, with drill and ration calls sounding by the hourglass. In Rhode Island, the British still held Newport. In New York, Clinton garrisoned his strong island. In Georgia, redcoats patrolled streets under the palmettos, while American detachments regrouped on the Savannah's upper reaches and along the back-country roads. In Paris, treaties already signed, the ministry fitted out more ships. In London, ministers tallied islands and regiments and learned to pronounce unfamiliar place names that now mattered to their ledgers. The war's shape by year's end was clear even to men who read maps by firelight. A stalemate in the north measured by rivers and works. A new front in the south measured by rice fields and tidewater roads. A frontier war that would demand a campaign of its own. And a sea war that had pulled two empires into the balance. The army that had left Valley Forge to test itself at Monmouth now knew its own capacity. The alliance that had arrived as parchment had become masts and anchors. Ahead lay a season of movements that would test all of it at once. Expeditions into Iroquois country, a British column down the Hudson that never quite formed, a siege before a southern city, and a battle at sea fought until the decks ran slick under another flag. For the moment, watch fires burned at the usual hours, patrols clicked over frozen ruts, and quartermasters counted shoes. The work of a global war had come to rest for a few cold weeks in camps that knew how to wait. Winter, 1778 to 1779, found the war balanced on several edges. The British held New York and Newport and had taken Savannah at year's end. Washington's army wintered again in New Jersey, this time around Middlebrook, with outposts watching the Raritan and the roads to the coast. In the interior, committees kept grain moving, inoculation rolls kept smallpox from choosing its own victims, and drill, now organized under a common blue book of regulations that officers copied and distributed, turned files into companies that could move and fire on the same count. In London, strategy bent south, where officials hoped loyalism, rice and ports could be turned into a new backbone for royal authority. In Paris and Madrid, the war widened. France was already in. Spain would join by summer, and with it would come new campaigns on waters and shores far from Pennsylvania's roads. The first months of 1779 tested, in quick alternation, the British hope of pacification in Georgia and the American ability to keep the countryside dangerous. In January and February, British detachments pushed inland from Savannah to Augusta, raised royal standards, and sought to rally loyalist militia. The experiment met hard ground. On February the 14th, Backcountry leaders Andrew Pickens, Elijah Clark, and John Dooley caught a Loyalist column under James Boyd at Kettle Creek, north of Augusta. The fight was short and hammering, woodlot to woodlot, volley and rush. The Loyalist force broke. Boyd fell. Many of his men were scattered, captured, or driven back across the Savannah River. The victory was local in size and regional in effect. It stiffened Whig militia in the back country and made the British position in the interior less a line than a scatter of posts connected by hope and patrols. To the north along the Hudson, a different pressure point flared. In early June, the British seized Stony Point and Verplank's Point, opposite ends of the ferry at King's Ferry, the main inland crossing between New England and the Middle Colonies, building works on the steep rock that commanded the approach. The loss pinched American communications and gave Clinton a place to pry. Washington, unwilling to accept a permanent British wedge there, studied the positions and waited for a night worth the risk. On July 16th, after midnight, Brigadier General Anthony Wayne led chosen light infantry in a bayonet-only assault along the Hudson's edge. Columns moved with unloaded muskets, no flashes to warn pickets, scaling abatis and rock under shouted passwords and sudden shouts. The works fell in minutes. Prisoners were taken in hundreds. The garrison's guns turned at once. By dawn, the American flag flew on the point. Washington evacuated the place days later, rather than be drawn into a set-piece fight on bad ground. But the message had been sent. The river could not be held by outpost alone. New Jersey's edge saw its own surprise. In August, Major Henry Light Horse Harry Lee led a night raid on the British post at Paulus Hook, today's Jersey City, crossing marshes at low tide, striking fast through the dawn watch, and withdrawing with prisoners before the larger garrison could close. These strokes did not change maps by themselves. They forced the British to garrison wider and to escort deeper, which thinned every column that went out to fetch forage or to punish a village that had ceased to pay. The British answered along the Connecticut shore with raids designed to frighten and to destroy supplies. In early July, a force under William Tryon landed near New Haven, then at Fairfield and Norwalk, burning stores and, in places, homes and churches, fighting local militia who assembled at short notice and fell back under weight. The fires lit harbor horizons and left marks that towns would carry in petitions for years. Strategically, they did not alter the larger geometry. Politically, they hardened attitudes in places where loyalism had once looked like a viable hedge. The southern shore saw larger swings. In late April and May, General Augustin Prevost marched from Georgia toward Charleston, testing whether the city could be bluffed into neutrality under royal protection while the British gathered strength. The move reached the outskirts. Defenders, regulars, militia, and citizen companies, mained lines hurriedly improved since the previous year's fight on Sullivan's Island. Negotiations failed. Prevost withdrew down the Ashley, leaving behind a rear guard at Stono Ferry. On June 20th, Major General Benjamin Lincoln sent Continentals and militia against that post to punish the retreat. The British, strongly placed with abatis fronting their camp, repelled the assault in a hard fight that cost both sides dear and confirmed that Charleston would not be taken or saved by a single thrust. For the moment, the British consolidated again around Savannah and the lower rivers. The frontier between New York and Pennsylvania felt the war differently. The prior year's raids, Wyoming and Cherry Valley, had persuaded Washington that, when resources allowed, a deliberate expedition must be sent to break the Iroquois Confederacy's capacity to support Loyalist and British operations. In the summer of 1779, he sent Major General John Sullivan north with Continental brigades and artillery, coordinated with a column under General James Clinton moving down the Susquehanna, after portaging boats from the Mohawk Valley and engineering a controlled flood from Otsego Lake to float them. In late August, near Newtown, outside today's Elmira, Sullivan met a force of loyalists under John Butler and John Johnson with Iroquois fighters, including warriors following Joseph Brant, in a prepared position. American artillery and steady advances turned the defenders' line. The position gave way, and the rest of the campaign became a systematic destruction of villages, crops, and stored corn throughout Seneca and Cayuga country. People fled toward Niagara and Canada. The Confederacy's ability to sustain large raiding parties into the borderlands was permanently reduced. The immediate cost fell, as always, on the civilians whose houses and fields had been turned into a military resource. The longer consequence reshaped the interior politics of the Northeast for a generation. Farther west and south, an American officer without a large army changed the map with speed. George Rogers Clark, operating under Virginia authority, had taken Kaskaskia and Cahokia the previous summer. In February 1779, he marched across flooded bottoms and winter rivers to Vincennes, surprised the British post at Fort Sackville, and accepted its surrender. The possession was tenuous, but it loosened British control in the Illinois country, and assured that, when diplomats later drew lines, the United States would claim the Northwest to the Mississippi by fact as well as by argument. On the sea, 1779 multiplied theaters. In June, Spain entered the war against Britain as France's ally. With that declaration came campaigns that did not touch American shores directly, but shaped British choices everywhere. A combined French and Spanish fleet in the Channel forced Britain to keep strength near home. A siege began at Gibraltar that would draw ships and men for years. In the Caribbean, islands changed flags as admirals counted sugar and anchorages. That summer, the French took St. Vincent and Grenada. A British fleet under Admiral John Byron, beaten in detail by weather and then at the Battle of Grenada, fell back to protect what it could. West Indian priorities thus pulled at the same regiments and ships that might otherwise have been used along the American seaboard. One small fight on salt water close to Britain's own coast left an outsized memory. In September, off Flamborough Head, John Paul Jones, commanding the refurbished French East Indiaman Bonhomme Richard with a small squadron, engaged the British frigate Serapis escorting a convoy. The battle ran long and murderous at close range in the dark. Both ships caught fire. The American flagship's guns burst. Boarding was attempted and repelled. Jones's battered hull fouled Serapis, and the fight became a sustained exchange of musketry and swivel fire across railings. By the end of the night, Serapis struck. Bonhomme Richard, mortally damaged, sank after the crews had been moved. Legend later supplied Jones with a line he may not have spoken. The fact requires no embroidery. A continental captain had beaten a Royal Navy frigate within sight of the English shore, and the newspapers in London printed the result with alarm. Back in the southern states, the alliance delivered a chance to break the new British foothold. In the late summer and early autumn, the Comte d'Estaing, after seizing islands in the Caribbean, sailed north with French troops and joined American forces under General Lincoln before Savannah. The defenders, under Prevost and then Alexander Maitland, strengthened works that ran from the river to swamps and marsh. Artillery opened. Approaches were begun. Then, fearing the loss of the season to sickness and storms, d'Estaing chose to risk an assault. On October the 9th, French and American columns went forward before dawn across open ground against redoubts fronted by abatis. The fire was withering. Some units reached parapets and fought hand to hand. Most were driven back. Count Casimir Pulaski, the Polish cavalry officer whose independent legion had served since 1777, was mortally wounded. D'Estaing himself was hit. The attack failed with heavy casualties. The siege was raised within days. The British held Savannah. Georgia remained for the moment a royal province in fact as well as in name. The northern coast shed one British post. In October, the garrison at Newport evacuated under orders to shorten lines and concentrate troops. The decision freed Rhode Island from occupation and allowed American and French plans to look more boldly toward the mouth of the Hudson. It also signaled a larger British consolidation in preparation for the push many had argued for since 1776, a major expedition against Charleston when weather allowed. By December, Clinton gathered transports and troops in New York Harbor. Sails were bent on yards through frost. The objective was an old one, now judged ripe. The year's last inland work along the Hudson went to spades and chains. Engineers tightened the works at West Point, closed the river with a great iron chain and booms once more for the winter, and cut roads on the bluffs above the turns. Across the river valleys, magazines accumulated flour and salt pork against the season's scarcity. In the army, the habits learned at Valley Forge matured into routine. Von Steuben's regulations, printed at last in Philadelphia and Hartford, gave sergeants a common book to teach from. Brigade inspectors carried the standards from unit to unit, so that a file in the Pennsylvania line and a file in the Maryland line could face the same problem and perform the same solution without discussion. The war's interior politics moved along at the same pace that wagons did. The Articles of Confederation, approved by Congress in 1777 and now ratified by many states, still awaited unanimous assent. Maryland held out, insisting on Western land cessions from states with sea-to-sea claims. Congress nonetheless behaved increasingly like a national government, contracting for supplies, commissioning officers on a common roll, and pressing states to fill quotas. Paper money, issued in growing sums, lost value by degrees that could be measured at market stalls. Committees tried to fix prices in some localities and found that scarcity ignored statutes. Privateers, however, turned letters of marque into more useful paper. Prize courts filled dockets with captured cargoes and vessels, and coastal towns learned to treat admiralty proceedings as part of ordinary civic life. In New York and Charleston, Loyalists continued to bet on British protection. Some raised provincial regiments, others supplied intelligence or simply waited behind lines that could be drawn on maps. In New Jersey, parole lists thickened with names of men allowed to remain on farms under promises of neutrality. In the Mohawk and along the Susquehanna, families once tied to the neutral language of the Covenant chain now moved with armies because their burned houses gave them no other choice. The war's social geography grew clearer each season. The closer to a garrison port, the more war resembled order. The closer to a frontier ford or a hill road, the more it resembled feud and endurance. In the Carolinas, after Savannah, the months closed with maneuvers that set the stage for the next year. British troops probed the Sea Islands and the Combahee. American detachments under Lincoln and Moultrie watched the lower rivers, ventured out to punish foraging parties, and pulled back when frigates moved into range. Inland, partisan leaders such as Francis Marion and Thomas Sumter were not yet the names they would become, but the networks that would carry their work. Kinship, knowledge of swamps and sand roads, and the habit of assembling quickly were in place. Diplomacy moved in its calendars while armies moved in theirs. Spain's declaration meant that Bernardo de Galvez, the young governor of Spanish Louisiana, could turn the lower Mississippi into a theater where victories might be claimed for Bourbon arms and indirectly for the American cause. In September, he took Fort Butte at Manchac and then Baton Rouge. Natchez followed by capitulation. These gains placed West Florida under pressure from the west and tied British resources needed elsewhere. In Europe, the combined Bourbon fleets Summer cruise in the Channel had not brought the invasion Britain feared, but the mere possibility forced the Admiralty to keep ships near home that could otherwise have pressed harder on American shores. By late December, transports in New York were packed tight with men, horses and guns for the Southern expedition. Clinton and Cornwallis sailed on the 26th, threading winter weather down the coast toward the bar at the mouth of Charleston's harbor. Washington, who could not match fleets, did what he could from New Jersey's hills. He kept the Hudson closed, sent warnings south, and urged the states of the Carolinas to prepare lines and magazines farther inland in case the first line failed. He also prepared his own army for a winter that would test it as severely as any campaign. Snow would lie deep around Morristown and Jockey Hollow before the winter was done. Supplies would run thin, roads would break under sledges, and the quiet work of keeping men fed and together would loom larger than any parade ground movement. When the year turned, the lines of effort were plain. In the north, a guarded stalemate, hardened by walls and anchored by a great river. In the south, a British lodgment ready to be expanded by a major siege against a city that had twice defied them. Along the inland woods, a campaign that had cut deep into Iroquois country would alter raiding for the rest of the war. At sea and abroad, new flags had entered the calculation, and the imperial quarrel that had begun over customs, paper, and representation now drew fleets into the Channel and sieges to the gates of Gibraltar. The American army, better drilled than a year before, and resigned to ration returns that were sometimes more paper than pork, went to ground for the season with pickets posted, watchfires tended, and dispatch riders ready. The next spring would bring the long forecast turned south in full, the kind of slow, heavy campaign that would take months to unfold and would measure endurance as surely as any assault across a field. Winter had not finished with the armies when the new year began to move the pieces. In Pennsylvania, on New Year's Day, 1781, cold in arrears broke discipline where bullets had not. The Pennsylvania line, veterans who had stood through the worst marches, mutinied at Morristown's outlying cantonments, marching south with grievances that were ledger deep, pay in paper that bought little, enlistments counted by officers one way and by men another, clothing lists that matched no man's back. They refused British entreaties and through civil mediators, rather than bayonets, forced settlements that sent some home and re-enlisted others on corrected terms. Weeks later, when a smaller echo came from the New Jersey line, Washington answered differently. Detachments under Robert Howe surrounded the camp. 2 ringleaders were shot before their comrades. The point was made with pain. Complaints might be heard. The army would not negotiate at gunpoint again. South, Nathanael Greene acted on a calculation the map confirmed. A weaker army gained strength by forcing a stronger one to make choices. He split his small force across the Carolinas. Daniel Morgan westward toward the back country, and the Catawba fords with a light corps of Maryland and Delaware Continentals, militia under Andrew Pickens, and William Washington's dragoons. Greene himself hovering east of the Catawba, with another wing to vex Cornwallis's center and watch the Santee line. Cornwallis sent Banastre Tarleton to strike Morgan before that thread could knot into anything larger. The meeting came on January 17th at a patch of pasture and scrub called the Cow Pens. Morgan arrayed his men in depth born of experience, a screen of riflemen with a single deadly task. Behind them a line of militia instructed to give 2 good volleys and fall back, and in reserve, Continentals under John Eager Howard, with Washington's horse masked to strike. Tarleton's column, light infantry, Legion cavalry, and the 7th Regiment pushed in hard. The riflemen's opening shots bit. The militia fired and withdrew as ordered, some more briskly than Morgan liked. Tarleton mistook purpose for panic and drove on. Howard's line absorbed the weight, wheeled by company with a steadiness the winter's drill had put into bone, and then advanced. Washington's dragoons hit the flank. Militia who had fallen back turned again on the far side. For a few minutes the field broke like a wave around a sandbar. When it settled, the British infantry was surrounded in pieces and compelled to lay down arms. Hundreds of prisoners, guns, colors. Morgan had won a rare, clean victory. Tarleton escaped with a handful of horse. Cornwallis, receiving the news, burned his baggage to quicken the pursuit and threw his army into a chase that would define the next month. The race to the Dan was not a dash so much as a series of measured strides. Morgan, his prisoners in tow, fell back toward the Catawba. Greene, gathering militia, and his other wing, moved to block and screen. January rivers swelled. Fords turned treacherous. Rear guards put just enough steel into each crossing to delay without breaking. At Cowan's Ford, militia under William Lee Davidson made the Catawba costly before giving way. Davidson fell, and his men drifted in 2s and 3s to the next line. Greene's staff sent riders to collect boats on the Dan River at Irwin's and Boyd's ferries. Wagons groaned through mud and frost. Cavalry patrols under Henry Light Horse Harry Lee and Andrew Pickens snapped at British flanks and then vanished into piney thickets. On February 14, 1781, Greene's main body crossed the Dan into Virginia, the last pickets hauling boats to the far bank, while Cornwallis's advance guard arrived breathless and late. The river, wide and full, was a wall again. Greene paused, gathered recruits and supplies, and then, once men had shoes and cartridge boxes had lead, crossed back into North Carolina to look his enemy in the eye. Virginia felt the war's hand in the same span. In early January, Benedict Arnold, now a British brigadier, sailed up the James with a small force, struck Richmond, burned public stores, and withdrew to a base at Portsmouth. The blow was less than a conquest and more than an insult. Cannon spiked, powder gone, the state government shocked into motion. In the spring, Major General William Phillips arrived to take command on that river. Militia and light detachments shadowed his moves. Then death removed him, and by May Cornwallis, broken off from his fruitless North Carolina chase, came into Virginia to gather the strands, Arnold's raiders, Phillips's survivors, and his own scarred regiments into a single hand. Between the Dan and the James, another line drew men together. On March the 15th, 1781, at a crossroads clearing near Guilford Courthouse, Greene accepted battle on terms he had chosen. He arrayed his army in 3 lines. Front ranks of North Carolina militia with open ground in front and fence rails to steady their fire. Behind them, Virginia militia, steadier and won by example. And on the 3rd line, the Maryland and Delaware Continentals with artillery anchoring the center. Cornwallis advanced as he had on other fields, through skirmishes and into volleys, the red line driving with the bayonet. The first militia line fired raggedly and fled in part. The second stood better and yielded by degrees. The last line fought hard, countercharged, and held until pressure across the front made the ground a patchwork of small combats, smoke, and hedgerows fought over twice. Late in the fight, with American and British units intermingled, Cornwallis ordered canister and round fired through friend and foe to break the knot. It worked, but at a price. At day's end, Greene withdrew in order, denying the ground. Cornwallis held a field pried open with grievous loss. By his own count, he could not afford to repeat the experience. He fell back to Wilmington to refit by sea, leaving a bloodied path that proved a tactic could be called victory and still be ruin. Greene turned south instead of following. His aim was not a single prize, but a process. reduce the web of posts that made British claims in South Carolina practical. Camden anchored the cord. Lesser forts looped along the Santee, Wateree, Congaree, and Savannah. On April 25th, at Hobkirk's Hill, outside Camden, Lord Rawdon struck Greene's encampment unexpectedly, and after a sharp fight, the Americans yielded the hill. But the wind did not change the arithmetic. Supplies grew scarce for the garrison. Partisan blows cut roads. Larger patterns made small reverses survivable. In early May, Rawdon abandoned and burned Camden, falling back toward the coastal corridor that ships could feed. Around and beneath these set-piece moments, a parallel war of ingenuity ran. On April 23rd, Americans under Francis Marion and Henry Lee took Fort Watson, not by storming its earthwork, but by building a tall log tower, the Maham Tower, to look down into the enclosure, exposing the defenders to fire that made the parapet untenable. On May the 12th, at Fort Motte, Rebecca Mott allowed her house, used by the British within the works, to be set afire with flaming arrows to hasten the garrison's surrender. Lee and militia colleagues moved quickly between posts, Granby, Orangeburg, and, after a formal approach, Augusta. Across the Savannah fell in May and early June, carving out the Midlands, while regular columns shadowed Rawdon's retreats. Greene laid siege to the strong post at 96 through late May and June, throwing trenches toward the Star Fort under steady counterfire. News of Rawdon's relief forced a risky assault on June 18th that failed in the ditch and on the abattis, the attackers falling back with dead and wounded for a prize they would take by evacuation weeks later rather than by ladder. While the Carolinas absorbed armies, the Gulf of Mexico registered the World War ledger in a way no order from London could undo. On May the 10th, 1781, Bernardo de Galvez, the Spanish governor at New Orleans, completed his campaign in West Florida by taking Pensacola after a siege punctuated by an accidental magazine explosion that tore through British works. With Baton Rouge and Mobile already taken, the Gulf Coast fell under Bourbon control. The result cut another British supply thread and confirmed that the conflict now ran on seas and shores far beyond North American rivers. In the north, New York remained the anchor of British power, and Rhode Island kept a French army that could not yet move far from its ships. Washington endeavored to turn delay into preparation. He posted detachments along the Hudson and the Jerseys and kept West Point secure after the autumn's narrowly averted treason. Officers drilled on the Blue Book until movements were matter of fact. Quartermasters laid up flour and salted meat where wagon roads held, tight against another winter's hunger. The Articles of Confederation at last took full effect on March 1st, 1781, when Maryland ratified. The Continental Congress became the Confederation Congress without changing rooms. A month later, Robert Morris accepted the office of Superintendent of Finance. He began to impose order on paper and promises, contracts that matched deliveries, tax requisitions sent to states with deadlines, funding schemes that pointed toward a national bank to stabilize credit. None of it gilded a coin that did not ring true. All of it made the year's back-end work less a gamble and more a plan. Virginia's theater widened in spring. After Wilmington, Cornwallis crossed into the state to link with the James River Raiders. Phillips died in May. The combined force under Cornwallis moved around Richmond and down the peninsula, burning stores, dismantling foundries, and scattering militia when they stood. Congress sent the young Marquis de Lafayette south with light infantry to shadow him. The Frenchman's orders were simple and difficult. Fight only when ground or numbers promised success. Keep the army intact. Save what could be saved. It became a cat-and-mouse campaign of marches and feints, Wayne and Steuben joining Lafayette. until late summer when the British commander, looking for a place to be fed and supported by the fleet and still strike inland on short notice, chose the bluffs and creeks around a small tobacco port on the York River. Back in the Carolinas, the Southern Army's spring and early summer work ripened into a late-season test in the swelter. On September 8, 1781, at Eutaw Springs, Greene met Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Stewart's force northwest of Charleston. The American line moved well at first. Militia steadied by experience leading, Continentals pressing through British camps and gardens, seizing guns and taking prisoners. Heat and scattered plunder pulled order toward risk. The British rallied on a sturdy brick house and a palisaded garden. Volleys from those hard points cut down attacks that tried to finish the day. Greene pulled off at last with captured pieces and the field disputed. In the days after, Stewart withdrew toward the coast, leaving his sick and wounded and burning stores he could not carry. By season's end, British control in South Carolina had been driven back to the defenses around Charleston and to posts held by habit rather than by confidence. A tactical draw had become a strategic retreat. On the Chesapeake, the sea had its own calendar. All summer in the Caribbean, the Comte de Grasse weighed the choices for his fleet. Sugar Islands and convoy duty on one side, a dash to North America on the other. Washington and Rochambeau met again and measured papers against tides. Through June and July, they kept up a show of threatening New York, building fascines and drawing maps that floated across desks within the city's walls as well as in Allied tents. Messengers rode fast horses to and from Newport and to French admirals in warm water. Money was borrowed on harder terms and then sent where it might make a march possible. The hinge lay offshore. If a French fleet chose the Chesapeake at the right moment and stayed long enough, a British army operating along the York and James would be a guest of its own navy. Through these movements, the daily work continued. In huts and farmhouses remade as depots, inspectors counted shirts. Surgeons logged inoculations so that smallpox would not thin ranks by chance. Committees of safety, now less visible than they had been in 1775, still settled disputes over price and loyalty in market towns and kept wagons moving with orders no drum announced. Privateers brought prizes into admiralty courts. Judges and juries, more practiced than they had been at the war's start, turned paper into proceeds that paid for sails and gun carriages. On frontier lines beyond the Appalachians, settlers rebuilt cabins between alarms. Men went out in small parties to guard fords that had no names on any map, and councils weighed alliances shaped by 3 winters of broken fields. By late summer, the war's pattern had shifted in ways that anyone reading a gazette could trace with a pencil. The British still held New York and Charleston. Savannah's garrison remained. Inland South Carolina and Georgia were no longer theirs in practice. Virginia, slapped and raided through spring, now held an adversary who had come to ground on a tidewater neck and begun to fortify it. Spain's flag flew over the Gulf's old British posts. French troops drilled on Rhode Island's fields under Rochambeau's eye, and a French admiral considered which American bay would matter most. The armies that had stumbled and stood since the first shots on village greens had learned a different kind of march. Not only to meet an enemy across a field, but to draw him to a place where fleets could make stone and earth decisive. The next move would come as ships rather than couriers, sails crowding a horizon that, for years, had only reflected other people's wars. The turn that had been prepared in letters, maps, and whispers came as sails on a horizon. Through July and August of 1781, Washington kept up the show of threatening New York, bridges measured on paper, fascines stacked in real heaps along the Hudson, while he and Rochambeau watched the sea. The French admiral in the Caribbean, the Comte de Grasse, weighed his options among islands and convoys and chose the Chesapeake. He wrote ahead that he would bring his fleet north in late summer and could stay in the bay for a limited time. That choice fixed the Allied plan. If a French fleet held the Capes at the mouth of the Chesapeake, the British Army operating along Virginia's rivers could be trapped between tides and trenches. In the last days of August, the Allied armies broke camp on the Hudson in real earnest. They crossed at King's Ferry, the French in powder blue coats, the Americans in brown and whatever else could be made to serve, and moved down through New Jersey in measured marches that hid their destination as long as possible. Clinton, inside New York, kept men ready to answer a strike he still expected to come at his own lines. Letters that had once only floated among Allied tents now crossed desks within the city, strengthening the misdirection. South of Trenton, the columns forded the Delaware, then followed the old roads through Philadelphia to the head of Elk River, where transports and rivercraft waited to carry units down the Chesapeake's long inlets toward the lower bays. Behind them, a smaller French squadron under de Barras slipped out of Newport and took the longer route outside Long Island to bring the siege train, heavy guns, shot, and every tool needed for slow, careful work to the appointed place. On August 30th, de Grasse arrived in the Chesapeake with a fleet of ships of the line and frigates, anchoring in Lynnhaven roads and landing French troops at the mouth of the James River. Cornwallis had already begun to concentrate his command at Yorktown on the York River's bluffs, fortifying there and at Gloucester Point across the water to secure a harbor and a base from which to keep up operations inland. He had done so confident that a fleet would make that position a bridge to further movement. It could also become a dockyard without an exit. Admiral Thomas Graves learned of the French arrival and put to sea from New York with British ships. On September the 5th, outside the Chesapeake Capes near the Virginia Capes, the fleets met. The French put to sea to draw the British away from the bay's mouth. Lines formed and swung in light winds. The day lengthened into a long, ragged battle of broadsides in which damage and loss fell on both sides, but command of the entrance did not change. When the firing ended, Graves withdrew to the north to refit. De Grasse returned to the Capes. The strategic outcome was clear enough. The bay stayed in French hands. A few days later, de Barras's convoy arrived safely with the siege artillery. A British squadron did not reappear in strength until it was too late to change the landward arithmetic. On September the 28th, Washington and Rochambeau joined Lafayette and the other light troops already on the ground. The Allied armies moved down the narrow peninsula between the York and James and began to invest Yorktown in a method that had been practiced before in other wars, but never yet on this continent on such a scale. The outer British works were probed. Pickets were pushed in. The ring tightened yard by yard. Engineers laid out positions. Fatigue parties hauled fascinas and gabions. Batteries were sighted with careful lines of fire. On the night of October the 6th, in darkness, the first parallel, trenches and gun platforms, went in, angled to bring the artillery to bear. The guns opened on October 9th, and the sound announced a cadence that would not stop until a white flag appeared. The bombardment had the thoroughness of a practiced craft. French and American batteries worked in relays so that their arcs clipped the parapets and enfiladed the approaches at intervals calculated to keep defenders off the works. Shells found storehouses. Round shot sought traverses. British guns answered until the weight made answering difficult. On October the 14th, the Allied commanders ordered an assault to seize two advanced redoubts, numbers 9 and 10, that anchored the British outer line. The plan was simultaneous. French troops under the Baron de Vioménil to take Redoubt 9 on the left. American light infantry under the Marquis de Lafayette to carry Redoubt 10 on the right. The Americans sent a column led in part by Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton. Their men moved with unloaded muskets, relying on bayonets to keep silence until they were in the ditch. They surged over abattis, across the parapet and into the work in minutes. On the left, the French, with elements of the Royal Deepen and other regiments, fought through heavy fire, turned the redoubt, and held it. In the space of an hour, 2 nails were driven into the plank across which the defenders had hoped to move. The second parallel moved forward the next night under the protection those captured works gave. The British tried to break the tempo. On October 16th, a sortie rushed out from the lines, spiked guns in 2 Allied batteries, and fell back under covering fire. Repairs undid the damage in hours. That night, Cornwallis attempted to ferry men across the York to Gloucester Point to escape the trap and continue the campaign inland. Weather brought the effort to a halt. A squall and tide scattered boats and made the far bank unworkable. By then, the works inside Yorktown were pitted and splintered. Ammunition ran low. Sickness and sleeplessness filled the gaps that shot and shell had made. On October the 17th, a drummer beat a parley on the battered parapet and a British officer under a flag sought terms. 2 days of negotiation ended in articles of capitulation that followed the customary forms. On October the 19th, 1781, British and German troops marched out of the lines and laid down their arms under the eyes of Allied officers who had learned this grammar in other places and times. General Cornwallis did not attend the ceremony. Brigadier General Charles O'Hara presented the sword. Washington directed that the formal surrender be made to General Benjamin Lincoln, the same officer who had been obliged to yield Charleston the previous year. The army inside Yorktown became prisoners of war. Ships in the river were claimed. Guns were turned over with their trunnions and trails intact. News ran outward faster than wagons ever could. In London, couriers reached ministers with the dispatches. Arguments that had been made in abstract for a year took on a different force when read aloud in cabinet. In New York, Clinton understood that the fleet had not come to help in time and that the field army he had hoped to use to pin the rebellion had been taken out of the war. In Paris and Madrid, the outcome confirmed a choice already made. Fleets and regiments would continue to be counted into the balance. In Virginia and the Carolinas, the practical effects were immediate. British posts inland that had relied on the promise of prompt reinforcement by sea now saw reinforcements sent elsewhere not at all. Prison wagons rolled north, feeding depots set along the roads for the Convention Army taken 2 years before and for new prisoners taken now. The year did not end the war by itself. British garrisons still held cities that mattered. New York at the mouth of the Hudson, Charleston on the Ashley and Cooper rivers, Savannah on the lower Savannah River. But the tenor shifted. In early 1782, Parliament voted to end offensive operations in North America. In March, Lord North's ministry fell. A new ministry took office more inclined to negotiate than to reconquer. Orders were drafted that placed priority on holding what could be held without wrecking the rest of the empire. The West Indies demanded ships and attention. Gibraltar, under siege since 1779, required sustenance and courage. In April 1782, in Caribbean waters off Dominica and Guadeloupe, a British fleet under Rodney and Hood inflicted a heavy defeat on de Grasse at the Saints, breaking lines and capturing the French admiral. It did not reopen the Chesapeake or refight Yorktown, but it reset naval balance in the islands and reminded all parties that sea power remained the war's grammar. On the American coast, British withdrawals came by steps. Savannah was evacuated in July 1782. Charleston remained into December. The months between were measured in patrols and negotiations more than in pitched fights. In South Carolina, the British line had contracted from the back country to strong points close to the sea by the autumn of the previous year. Now, even those were treated as temporary. American officers and civil authorities moved cautiously into spaces left behind, reappointing magistrates, assessing damage, and trying to attach local oaths back to state governments. Skirmishes did not stop. Neither did the partisan habits that had grown over 2 years of raids and reprisals. For many families in the interior, peace would be a word that took a season to prove itself. Diplomacy, which had worked in parallel to every campaign since 1776, caught up to events. In Paris, where American commissioners had long kept rooms and made introductions, Benjamin Franklin the Constant, joined by John Adams, John Jay, and, when exchange and travel allowed, Henry Laurens, talk moved from sympathy and supplies to articles with lines and ports named. The French foreign minister, Vergennes, followed his own ledger and map, seeking a peace that would satisfy French aims against Britain while keeping a new American state friendly. Spain's concerns, Gibraltar and colonies, joined the calculations. The American commissioners found that the alliance that had brought fleets into the Chesapeake did not require them to accept every French suggestion at the table, and they opened direct channels to British negotiators when those presented a path to favorable terms. Complexities not measured by armies, fishing rights off Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, boundaries in the interior, the treatment of loyalists, and the payment of British creditors filled drafts and redrafts. Events far from Paris added pressure. In September 1782, the long siege of Gibraltar reached its crisis with an assault using floating batteries meant to withstand British cannon and burn the fortress from the sea. The attack failed under sustained fire from the Rock's guns, and with help from a relief expedition, the fortress held. British ministers had to balance the cost of defending an empire stretched across oceans against the prospects of further war or renewed taxes. Cabinets changed, positions softened. In late November 1782, British and American negotiators signed preliminary articles that recognized American independence and set broad boundaries at the Mississippi to the west and the Great Lakes to the north, pending the conclusion of full treaties among all belligerents. News of that preliminary arrangement reached Congress in the winter and spring following. Guns did not fall silent everywhere at once. They thinned. On the ground that men could see, change showed first in garrisons closing out routines. In New York, packets came and went with orders that grew more final in tone. In the Carolinas, the British began to pull out of outlying posts and concentrate men and material for a last embarkation. On December the 14th, 1782, American troops marched into Charleston as the last British unit sailed. Families that had lived for years within a world of pass and paroles adjusted to a civil order that would take months to feel familiar again. In Savannah, the previous summer, the British evacuation had emptied barracks and warehouses and sent loyalist families to islands and to the Floridas, which were themselves about to change flag. Evacuation was as much the movement of households as it was the movement of regiments. Within Washington's camps and in places where men had gathered coats and muskets for years, the strain of endurance gave way to the awkwardness of waiting. The winter of 1782 to 1783 was easier in weather than the one at Morristown had been, but it carried a different weight. Officers had served long without regular pay. Men wanted discharge dates and promises kept. Congress's finances, improved by Robert Morris's reforms but still tight, could not satisfy every claim at once. Discontent moved in private letters and in murmurs in regimental streets. Washington, who had held together a force in worse times by habit and example, now had to hold it through a silence that could be as dangerous as cannon fire if it broke the wrong way. Those tensions would find their moment in the spring, not under fire, but in a meeting where an army's obedience to civil authority would be tested in words. Meanwhile, in the villages and cities that had fed the army or endured occupation, people began to count in a new way. Courts reopened fully with dockets that had accumulated years of dispute. State legislatures rewrote tax rolls and sank old paper into new promises. Admiralty courts still sat because captures continued at sea until the last formal peace was signed, and prizes had to be adjudicated. Merchants wrote to British correspondents about debts that predated independence and would have to be sorted according to language only now being drafted for treaties. Those matters did not fit in a parade, but they were part of the settlement of a war begun over the question of who could write rules for commerce and law. The war's global edges sent back their own closing notes. Spanish flags flew over West Florida. Gibraltar stayed stubbornly British. The French and British in the Caribbean kept a wary watch, their local treaties and cartels managing exchanges of prisoners and small wars over sugar, until signatures in Europe made their orders plain. Ships returned to docks with fewer guns run out, more bales below decks. Crews took to shore to find that the ports they remembered had changed in small ways. A new official with a different haircut at the custom house, a different arrangement of flags on the masts along a wharf. What had begun at wharves with paper and tea, what had become entrenchments under Boston and river ice at Trenton, what had stretched over lakes, islands, and frontiers became, in late 1781 and 1782, a matter shaped by fleets, cabinets, and a siege where calculations held steady for a month and broke in a day. Yorktown did not end the war instantly. It ended the argument that a colonial revolt could be reduced by force without breaking other parts of an empire. From that point, the measures were negotiations, withdrawals, and the careful packing of archives and personal possessions into crates that would go on ships. As winter 1782 turned to spring, soldiers still kept watch bills, but they also looked more often at orders posted about furloughs and discharges. The chain across the Hudson still scraped when raised and lowered, but more boats were moving under it with passengers rather than patrols. On the lower bay outside New York, merchantmen began to anchor with the caution of men who knew that terms were close, and that a miscalculation on one tide might be made moot by a signature on another. The final chapters, paper turned into treaty, an army mustered out, a commander laying down his commission, waited on the same couriers who had once carried maps and codes. The fields were quieting. The rooms where documents were read grew busier. Spring moved first on paper. In March 1783, word reached Washington's camp on the Hudson that British and American negotiators in Paris had signed preliminary articles the previous November. Formal peace waited on France and Britain to settle their own terms, but the shape was set. At Newburgh, where the army's huts spread across the hills above the river, the news did not steady everything it touched. Officers and men had carried arrears of pay, promises of half pay or commutation, and notes that bought less each month. Anonymous addresses passed through the lines, calling for a meeting without orders to decide whether the army should insist, by threat if necessary, on what it was owed. The specter was not of mutiny as on a single cold night, but of an army, victorious and unpaid, becoming a political instrument. Washington answered with the same tools he had used against worse odds: timing, presence, and a careful share of ceremony. He countermanded the unauthorized gathering and called his own for March 15th in the long, drafty building used as a chapel. He spoke plainly, no threats, no grand phrases, about civil control, about the reputation of the army they had built, about the danger of staining a victory that had taken 8 years to win. Then, as he reached for a letter to read, he fumbled for spectacles rarely worn in public and said, almost to himself, that he had grown gray in the service of his country and now found himself nearly blind. The room shifted. Men who had counted grievances as a kind of armor recognized a different sort of claim, that endurance bound them to more than a pay table. When the resolutions were put, the officers rejected the anonymous call and affirmed their obedience to Congress. Within weeks, Congress approved a compromise, commutation of half pay for a fixed sum to be paid in interest-bearing certificates, and named Robert Morris and his new financial machinery to make the paper solve more than today's meeting. A month later, the guns were silenced by order. On April 19, 1783, the 8th anniversary of Lexington and Concord, Washington issued a proclamation announcing the cessation of hostilities. In New York, Sir Guy Carleton, who had replaced Sir Henry Clinton the previous spring with instructions to wind down the war, sent out his own notices. Prisoner exchanges accelerated, patrol routes shrank, the Hudson's great chain lifted and fell more often for cargo boats than for guard craft. The work of an army turned from maneuvers to musters, rolls corrected, equipments turned in, furloughs granted, regiments consolidated, and men, some with paper enough to carry home, some with land warrants they would not cash for years, walking away in small knots along roads they had first marched in files. Diplomacy caught up with events through the same summer. Britain and France settled their accounts in Europe and the West Indies. Spain, still besieging Gibraltar and holding gains along the Gulf, closed its war with Britain in the larger peace. On September the 3rd, 1783, 3 documents were signed in Paris that together ended the conflict. Britain recognized the independence of the United States and drew boundaries that ran from the Atlantic to the Mississippi and from the Great Lakes to Florida. France and Spain made their own separate peaces with Britain, shifting islands and frontiers according to arrangements made far from any American road. Fishing rights off Newfoundland and in the Gulf of St. Lawrence were secured for American crews. British creditors' claims were acknowledged in principle, and Congress earnestly recommended that the states restore property to loyalists where feasible. The words would prove easier than the execution, but the map, long imagined and often guessed at, was now written. Evacuations followed the signatures in an irregular rhythm. Savannah had been given up in July 1782, Charleston in December. Their wharves changed flags and their streets, slowly, their customs. New York was different. The largest British garrison, the most complicated ledger of contracts, debts, and families. Carleton oversaw the embarkation with a particular insistence on the fate of black men and women who had reached British lines under proclamations that promised freedom. Clerks compiled lists, later known as the Book of Negroes, recording names, ages, and owners' claims so that those who had secured liberty under the Crown could leave for Nova Scotia or other destinations without being seized on the docks. Thousands of loyalists, merchants, artisans, provincial soldiers, and families boarded ships as well, bound for Canada, the remaining British islands, or England. Some would find new towns on cold shores. One of those places, carved from Nova Scotia the next year, would be called New Brunswick. The war's end rearranged lives as surely as it had borders. Congress sat that winter in Annapolis, a peripatetic capital suited to a government that could not yet tax and could scarcely pay. On November the 25th, 1783, British troops marched out of New York. American units marched in. Later, in early December, Washington came to the city and, at Francis Tavern on Pearl Street, took leave of his officers. The witnesses remembered it as a quiet rite. A few words, a raised glass, embraces offered and returned. A commander walking out to a barge through streets that had been enemy headquarters for 7 years. He rode south thereafter, stopping at legislatures and towns, the pace of a civilian traveler stitched to the last obligations of command. On December 23rd, He entered the chamber in Annapolis where Congress sat, handed back his commission, and, in a short speech, thanked the body he had served. Symbolists later made more of the moment than he did that day, but the fact is plain enough. A general surrendered power to a civil assembly and then went home. Home meant Mount Vernon, reached at dusk on Christmas Eve. The river below the house carried none of the urgency that had filled so many crossings. Ledgers there turned on tobacco and rents. A household that had been managed by letters for nearly a decade adjusted to a presence again in hallways and fields. The winter that followed did not yet decide how a nation would govern itself. It did prove that an army could dissolve without its commander becoming something else. The larger settlements clicked into place more slowly. The United States, under the Articles of Confederation, had a name abroad and little power at home. Debts accumulated during the war pressed on Congress. Requisitions to the states returned thin. Notes issued in the worst seasons had sunk so far below silver that a proverb carried their value in their bitterness. Morris's reforms, the first rough outlines of a national revenue system and a national bank, imposed some order, and treaties with the Netherlands, which had recognized American independence in 1782, Sweden and others expanded the circle of normal commerce. Land, more than coin, answered for many promises. Officers and soldiers received warrants for tracts in the Trans-Appalachian West. States with old sea-to-sea claims ceded territories to the common government in principle. Surveys began that would, a few years later, turn forest and prairie into ranges and townships under ordinances not yet written in 1783, but already imagined when lines were drawn across crude maps. None of it paid a teamster tomorrow. All of it made tomorrow more predictable than the day after any previous war on this continent. For people who had taken different sides, the peace did not settle with equal ease. Loyalists who stayed applied for protection or endured prosecutions, depending on neighborhood and state. Some returned from Canada when tempers cooled and laws were amended. Others built new lives along the St. John River or on Cape Breton. Black loyalists evacuated to Nova Scotia found their promised freedom often narrowed by hunger and contracts that pressed on their time and labor. Some, a decade later, would leave again for Sierra Leone. Native nations, whose diplomacy and power had shaped every frontier decision before and during the war, saw treaties drawn without their consent. British forces lingered at forts along the Great Lakes and in the Ohio Valley, citing American failures to restore Loyalist property and to pay debts as reasons to hold posts that the treaty named otherwise. For settlers flowing across the mountains and for the Shawnee, Miami, Haudenosaunee, and others who already lived there, peace would require negotiations and wars not yet counted among the Revolutionary years only because the calendar says so. Privateers came home or out of business as admiralty courts wound down their busiest dockets. The Continental Navy, never large, always spread thin, was largely sold off. Prisoners returned in sad trickles. Some, exchanged sooner, arrived back gaunt in earlier seasons. Others, like men held on the hulks in Wallabout Bay during the war, came home only as stories and names in parish records. Churches put back bells that had been cast into guns. Mills threw new water on wheels. Schoolmasters retrieved pupils at different ages than the registers showed the day they had closed. There were new associations and old worries. In May 1783, officers meeting on the Hudson formed the Society of the Cincinnati to maintain fellowship and, in their view, to keep alive the memory and principles of the struggle. Critics saw in its membership and hereditary provisions a shadow of what they had just refused to accept, titles by another name. The debate, sharp in pamphlets and letters, previewed arguments the next decade would rehearse about virtue, ambition, and the shape of a republic. For the moment, the matter remained an argument, not an order of battle. Across the water, cabinets changed. Lord North's ministry had fallen the previous spring, others followed it. By the time the preliminary articles were public, a government willing to let the American war go had found the parliamentary votes to do so. Gibraltar, held after a grand assault, failed in 1782. In April 1782, the British fleet had defeated de Grasse at the Saintes in the Caribbean, rebalancing the naval war there without touching what had been fixed at Yorktown. The global conflict that had widened from a tax on paper to an imperial reckoning began to narrow again towards normal rivalry. The peace with the United States was one peace, not the center of a settlement among empires. The formal close came with paper as it had begun. On January 14, 1784, the Confederation Congress, still in Annapolis, ratified the Treaty of Paris within the deadline the document required. Wax and signatures completed what marches and sieges had made possible. Copies went to Europe on late winter ships. Some soldiers, still waiting for final discharges and settlements, read about ratification in broadsides posted on tavern doors. Storekeepers, who had sold on credit under one flag and would now be paid under another, entered the date in ledgers so that, 10 years later, an argument about rates of exchange could find its footing in memory. The war's cost is not wholly counted by tallies of dead and debts, but those lists mattered and still do. Somewhere between 20 and 30,000 British soldiers and German auxiliaries died during the conflict, of wounds and disease. American military deaths, in and out of battle, ran to a similar band. Civilian deaths on frontiers and in occupied towns defied good measure. The national debt at war's end scared men who remembered the solvents that had been tried in the 1770s and feared to try them again. Yet, the habits set in the army, returns that match reality, supplies placed where roads can find them, a common drill that turns strangers into companies, remained as civic lessons. Out of that discipline would come in a few years a different settlement on government than the articles could hold. In the meantime, the country resumed its older sounds. On the Hudson, the chain that had scraped iron on iron for years was hauled ashore and laid down on grass. Watch bells in cities still struck the hours, but they called out fires and market days more often than alarms. In Boston, the Liberty Tree was gone, cut down in the early years of the war, but men and women who had stood beneath it kept its shade alive in memory and in the habits of town meeting. In Charleston, palmetto logs from the island fort weathered into souvenir canes. In a farmhouse near Saratoga, a patch of field where smoke once lay low grew wheat again. Children ran errands on streets that had seen troops go by. Schoolmasters picked up chalk where the last date on the board had been written in a different king's regnal year. As for Washington, the man most people meant when they said the army, even when they knew better, he lived as a planter for a while and as a correspondent always. He answered letters from former officers about land, from legislators about rivers, from foreign well-wishers about the ideas they shared. Reports circulated across Europe that King George III, asked what he thought the general would do after victory, had said that returning to private life would make him the greatest man in the world. Whether the line was spoken as printed or not, the act it described had happened. It reset expectations for a republic that had not yet learned how to be one. You can trace the arc of these years with a finger on a map: Boston, New York, the Delaware, the Upper Hudson, Saratoga, the Schuylkill, the Santee, the York, and still miss what they were like to live. They were ferries taken in sleet and in high summer. They were petitions folded and carried to rooms where men had to choose. They were habits of order learned until they felt older than they were. They were withdrawals that preserved an army and charges that decided a morning. They began with attacks that seemed small to some and intolerable to others, and grew because every attempt to solve a narrow problem by force opened a wider one. They ended not in a single burst of trumpets, but in the slow untying of knots. Ships departing with families on deck, a general handing back a commission, a legislature ratifying a treaty, an army turning in muskets and going home by twos and threes. In the quiet that followed, harbors took back the work of peace. Crews called soundings, carpenters set masts, clerks entered cargoes in neat hands. Inland, surveyors shouldered chains and walked the lines that would become townships. The document that had called itself a declaration became, in practice, a country that would need a stronger frame than the one that carried it through the war. That task belonged to another set of years. This story ends where the fighting ends, with the chain across the Hudson resting, with watch bells marking hours no longer arranged by alarms, and with a people who had made a nation discovering, one court day and one harvest at a time, what it meant to keep it